She had baked through blizzards, through debt, through a dead husband who left her nothing but bruises and silence. She had rebuilt herself from nothing, flour-dusted hands and all. Then one Sunday morning, her own son stood in her kitchen, not to check on her, not to bring groceries, but to slide a piece of paper across her table and say, "Sign it, Mom. The bakery's worth more sold than standing." He wanted her livelihood, her identity, the only thing she'd ever built that was truly hers. And she almost did it. Almost. If you've ever had someone try to take the one thing you fought hardest to keep, stay with me, because this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what comes next. And if this already has you feeling something, hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The morning Clara Winslow burned the first pie she'd made in 11 years wasn't an accident. It was a Tuesday, and she'd been awake since 4, same as always. Not because habit demanded it, but because sleep had stopped coming easy sometime around her 43rd birthday, and never really came back. She was 51 now, and she'd made a kind of peace with the dark hours. Used them. The bakery on Sycamore Street didn't open until 7, but Clara was always there by 4:30, coaxing the old oven to life, testing the morning air with the back of her hand, the way her grandmother had taught her when she was still small enough to stand on a step stool to reach the counter. That morning, though, something was off. She'd measured wrong. Too distracted. She didn't realize it until the smell hit her. That specific, stomach-dropping sweetness of apples turning from caramelized to scorched, and by then the damage was done. She pulled the pan out, set it on the rack, and just stood there looking at it. 12 years ago, burning a pie would have sent her into a quiet spiral. She'd have picked apart every step, every measurement, every second she'd let her attention drift. Now she just looked at it and thought, well, that's a pie that happened. She scraped it into the trash, washed the pan, and started again. That was Clara Winslow in a sentence, really. She started again. She'd been starting again her whole life, which maybe explained why she was so good at it and so tired of needing to be. She'd started again after her mother died when Clara was 19, leaving her with a failing roadside diner and a brother who disappeared into a bottle 3 months later and never really came back out. She'd started again after Thomas, after the marriage she didn't talk about, the 7 years that had ground her down to something she barely recognized in the mirror. She'd filed the papers the same week her youngest, Danny, started kindergarten, and she remembered sitting in the parking lot outside the courthouse thinking, now what? The answer had turned out to be baking. She'd always baked. It was the one thing Thomas hadn't managed to make ugly, maybe because he didn't understand it, couldn't quantify it. He'd understood money and appearances and the particular satisfaction of watching someone smaller than him flinch. But flour and butter and the patient alchemy of heat, that had been hers alone. She'd started selling pies out of her kitchen to 3 neighbors, then 5, then 20, and within 2 years she'd saved enough to lease the space on Sycamore. Within 4 years she'd paid the lease in full and bought the building. She was proud of that. She let herself be proud of it, which hadn't always come naturally. The bakery was called Clara's. No last name, no flourish. She'd gone back and forth on the name for weeks, and then her friend Doris had pointed out that everyone in town already called it that anyway, so she might as well make it official. The sign above the door was hand-painted by a local artist, a retired schoolteacher named Peg, who'd done it in exchange for a standing weekly order of sourdough and 2 apple turnovers, a trade Clara had considered one of the better deals of her life. It was Doris who'd first pointed out Silas Mercer. "That man's been here 4 Saturdays in a row," Doris said one October afternoon, not exactly whispering. Doris had never been much of a whisperer. She was 72 and had decided somewhere around 68 that the effort of discretion was no longer worth it. Same slice every time. Apple, 1 fork, black coffee. He sits at that corner table for exactly 40 minutes. "Lots of regulars do the same thing," Clara said. "Lots of regulars don't look at you the way he does." Clara had deliberately not looked up from the bread she was wrapping. "Doris, I'm just observing." Observe quieter. She'd been aware of him, of course. You couldn't not be. Silas Mercer was the kind of man who didn't try to take up space and somehow took it anyway. Tall, with the particular kind of stillness that came from decades of physical work, slowing down to something deliberate. I was somewhere in his mid-50s, she guessed, with gray at his temples and a jaw that looked like it had been decided on rather than grown. He dressed the same every week. Clean flannel, dark jeans, boots that had seen genuine use. No affectation, no jewelry except a plain watch. He always said the same thing when he ordered. Slice of apple, please, and coffee if it's not a bother. Always the if it's not a bother, which after the third or fourth time she'd noticed had nothing to do with the coffee and everything to do with the way he said it. Like he'd spent a long time making sure he wasn't a bother to anyone and had gotten very practiced at the phrasing. She hadn't thought about it much. Then she'd thought about it a little. Then she'd thought about it enough to be annoyed at herself for thinking about it. He'd introduced himself properly on the 6th Saturday, not in a pushy way, just he'd waited until the morning rush thinned out and then came to the counter rather than waiting for her to come to him, which she'd noticed, and said, "I don't think I've properly said, I'm Silas Mercer. I've got a place out past the Callaway Road. I've been meaning to say thank you. This pie." He'd paused. "I don't know how you do it. My wife used to make something close. Nothing I've had since has come close. Until this." It was the most personal thing a stranger had said to her in a long time, and she hadn't quite known what to do with it. "I'm glad it means something," she'd said, which was honest if not exactly warm. "Does it take long, the recipe?" "Depends what you mean by long. I start the crust the night before, the fillings same day." "Overnight." He'd nodded, like that explained something. "That's why." "Why what?" "Why it tastes like something that mattered." She'd thought about that on the drive home. Tastes like something that mattered. It was a strange thing to say. She'd decided she liked it. His wife's name had been Ellen. She learned that over the following weeks, not in any single conversation, but in pieces. The way you learn things about a person who isn't trying to impress you, who is just talking. Ellen had died 4 years ago, cancer that moved fast and left no room for preparation. They'd had 31 years, 2 sons, both grown, both somewhere that wasn't Montana. He ran the ranch with seasonal help and one permanent hand named Pete, who'd been with him for 15 years, and who he mentioned the way some people mention furniture. Always there, slightly taken for granted, would be devastated if it were gone. Clara offered her own pieces in return, carefully. She mentioned Danny, her son, 26 now, a lawyer in Billings, and her daughter Rachel, who lived in Portland with her husband and twin girls. She didn't mention Thomas by name. She mentioned once, when it came up sideways, that she'd been on her own for a long time and preferred it. She'd watched his face when she said that. He'd just nodded. Hadn't pushed. Hadn't done that thing some men did, the subtle suggestion that on her own was a temporary condition awaiting correction. She'd appreciated that more than she could have explained. The conversation stayed in the bakery for the first 2 months. That felt right. Neutral ground. Her space. Her terms. He never overstayed. He never arrived before hours or lingered after close. He was, she thought, almost deliberately careful about not crowding her, and she couldn't decide if that was instinct or if he understood somehow that she needed the walls where they were. In November, he'd mentioned, with no apparent agenda, that the old Whitmore apple orchard about 3 miles from his place still had trees producing if anyone wanted them. "Pete and I get more than we can press. I usually let the deer have the rest. Seems like a waste when there's a baker who could use them." Clara had a supplier she was happy with. She'd been about to say so. Instead, she'd heard herself say, "What variety?" "Honey Crisp mostly. Some old galas that have been there since the 60s. "Old galas," she said. "Those are harder to find." "They are." She'd bought 2 bushels from him the following week, and the pie that Saturday had been, even she had to admit, something slightly different. Better. Doris had eaten 2 slices and then given Clara a look that communicated approximately 7 separate opinions. "Don't," Clara had said. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to say 6 things. I was going to say the pie is extraordinary and ask if you happen to know where the apples came from." "Supplier. A very specific kind of supplier who drives 40 minutes each way on a Saturday morning." Clara had walked away. Doris had smiled at the back of her head. The thing was, and Clara had turned this over in her mind more than she would ever admit to anyone, she wasn't afraid of Silas Mercer. That was the strange part. She'd spent years constructing very precise internal alarm systems around men who seemed kind but probably weren't, around charm that felt like a lure, around attentiveness that was really just a better designed version of control. Those systems had served her. She didn't regret building them, but they hadn't fired. Not once. Not in 2.5 months of Saturdays and careful conversation and a man who bought apple pie and talked about his dead wife without performing grief, and listened when she spoke without waiting for his turn. That scared her more than the alarm would have, because she knew how to handle danger she could name. She'd been doing it her whole adult life. What she didn't know how to handle was something that felt quietly and persistently like the opposite of danger. December came, and with it the pre-Christmas rush that turned her bakery into a small, fragrant chaos from 7 in the morning until close. She'd hired a part-time helper, a college student named May, who had good hands and no spatial awareness whatsoever, and who managed to knock an entire rack of cooling rolls onto the floor within her first 40 minutes, but then cleaned them up so efficiently and apologized so genuinely that Clara had immediately forgiven her and raised her hourly rate. Silas still came on Saturdays. The lines were longer in December, the wait sometimes 30 minutes. He waited. He didn't complain. He brought her a bag of the Honey-Crisp apples one Saturday in early December without being asked, and said simply, "Thought you might be running low." And she'd said, "I was, actually." And that had been the whole exchange, and she'd thought about it for 3 days. It was Doris, again, always Doris, who pushed the door open on the Saturday before Christmas, 2 hours before close, and said, "You should know he's been standing out front for 20 minutes. Clara had been in the middle of counting the register. "Who has?" "The man who brings you apples." She'd looked up. "He comes in every Saturday." "He's not coming in. He's just standing there." Clara had untied her apron without quite deciding to and walked to the front window. He was out there, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the sidewalk. He wasn't pacing. He was just standing the way people stand when they're trying to talk themselves into something. She watched him for a moment. Something shifted in her chest. Not the romantic flutter she would have dismissed and been embarrassed by, but something older and quieter. Recognition, maybe. She knew that posture. She'd stood like that outside the courthouse with the divorce papers in her hand. Like that outside the bank when she'd applied for the first business loan. Like that outside this very building before she'd signed the lease, when the fear of her own hope had nearly been enough to make her walk away. She went outside. He looked up, and something crossed his face she couldn't name. Relief, maybe, and then immediately the reflexive desire to look like he hadn't felt it. "Silas," she said. Not warm, not cold, just his name. "Clara," he exhaled. "I was going to come in." "You've been out here a while." "I know." A pause. I wanted to ask you something, and I've been trying to figure out if it's the kind of thing you ask or the kind of thing you don't." She waited. "There's a Christmas dinner at the Halverson place on Thursday. Community thing. Ed Halverson does it every year, brings in half the county. I go every year because Ed's been a friend for 30 years, and because Pete refuses to cook, and we'd both be eating canned soup otherwise." A beat. "I was going to ask if you'd want to come with me. Not—" He stopped. "I mean, I know you probably have plans, or you might not want to, or this might be completely out of line, in which case I apologize and we forget I said anything." She looked at him. He was terrible at this. Not in a charming, calculated way, genuinely, uncomfortably bad at it, like someone who had spent 4 years being alone and had forgotten the mechanics. She found, unexpectedly, that she respected that enormously. "It's not out of line," she said carefully. He waited. "My daughter's coming Thursday. She and her girls are driving up from Portland, and they're staying through the weekend." His expression shifted, and she watched him absorb it. The quiet, dignified retreat of a man who had prepared himself for exactly this. "Of course," he said. "Of course, that's good. Good that she's coming." "Silas?" "Yeah. Ask me again. After the holidays." He looked at her for a long moment, like he was checking if he'd heard that right. "After the holidays," she said again, "when things slow down." She went back inside before he could respond, before either of them could make it more than it was. She returned to the register, picked up where she'd left off. May appeared from the back with a tray of shortbreads and didn't say a word, but she was smiling in a way that suggested she'd been watching from the window the entire time. "Not a word," Clara said. "I haven't said anything." "Don't." May set the shortbreads down with absolutely no expression on her face and turned back toward the kitchen, and Clara heard the smallest, most carefully muffled laugh before the door swung shut. The holidays came. Rachel and the girls arrived Thursday afternoon, and the house filled up with the particular chaos of 6-year-old twins who moved like weather systems. Clara made Christmas cookies and let her granddaughters frost them badly, and told them they were beautiful. She called Danny, and they talked for 40 minutes about nothing and everything. She opened a bottle of the good wine she'd been saving and didn't have a specific reason to save for, and she drank it with Rachel on the couch after the girls were down. And Rachel said, in that careful way she had, "You seem different." Different how? I don't know. Less braced for something. Clara looked at her wine glass. I'm always braced for something. I know, that's why different. She hadn't said anything about Silas. Not yet. There wasn't enough to say, and she wasn't ready for her daughter's hope on her behalf, which Rachel wore openly and completely, and which Clara found both touching and faintly exhausting. New Year's passed quietly. Clara closed the bakery for 3 days. The first time she'd done that voluntarily since she'd opened, and spent them reorganizing, repainting the back wall of the kitchen, a color she'd been meaning to change for 2 years, and sleeping past 6, which felt like a small revolution. The first Saturday of January, Silas came in. The bakery was quieter than December. Just 2 other customers, both regulars who took their things and left. He ordered his usual. He sat in the corner. He ate the first few bites in silence, which was normal, and then he looked up when she came to refill his coffee and said quietly, "Is now after the holidays?" Clara set the carafe down. She felt something she recognized as the edge of something she'd been standing at the edge of for months. That same sidewalk standing, hands in pockets hesitation she'd watched him perform before Christmas. She thought about the courthouse, the bank, the unsigned lease. She thought about every time the fear of her own hope had nearly been enough. "There's a restaurant in town," she said. "Farley's. It's not fancy, but it's good and it's not this counter." I was very still. "Friday," she said. "If you're not busy Friday." "I'm not busy Friday," he said, in a way that suggested he would have made himself not busy Friday. She picked up the carafe and walked back to the counter. From the kitchen, May dropped what sounded like a sheet pan and then said very clearly, "Yes." Clara pressed her lips together, didn't laugh. Almost. That almost was its own kind of something. Farley's turned out to be exactly what Clara had said it was. Not fancy, but good. It was the kind of place that had been in the same location for 30 years and hadn't bothered to update the menus because the food hadn't changed, and neither had the people who came for it. Red vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner that actually worked, a waitress named Bev who called everyone honey without it feeling condescending. The kind of restaurant where you could hear the conversation at the next table if you wanted to, and where nobody was pretending they were somewhere more important. Clara had been there 100 times. She'd never once paid attention to what it looked like until she walked in with Silas Mercer beside her and realized, with a start, that half the people at the surrounding tables were her customers. Bev seated them in the corner booth, the one slightly more private than the others, and Clara couldn't tell if that was luck or if Bev was doing her a deliberate kindness. She decided not to think about it. They ordered coffee before anything else, the same way they always had, which made Clara feel steadier. Some people needed candles and a different version of themselves to have a first dinner with someone new. Clara needed recognizable patterns and the ability to leave quickly if necessary. Coffee, first, always. "You're looking at the room," Silas said. She brought her eyes back to him. "Am I?" "You're checking who's here." Force of habit, small town. I know the feeling. He wrapped both hands around his mug. It's different being watched when you actually care about the outcome. She looked at him. That was more direct than she'd expected, more self-aware. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "Being watched?" He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. He didn't rush to the comfortable answer. "Not the way it used to. When Ellen first got sick, half this town was watching us the same way, waiting to see how we'd handle it. After a while, you either break under it, or you just stop letting it land." "Which did you do?" "Broke first," he said, no hesitation, then stopped letting it land. "In that order." She nodded. She understood that sequence. The dinner lasted 2 hours and 12 minutes. She knew because she'd checked her phone once when he went to the restroom and then felt immediately ridiculous about it. They talked about nothing particularly consequential and everything that quietly mattered. He told her about the ranch and the kind of detail that revealed he loved it the way some people loved a difficult relative, completely, exhaustedly, without being able to imagine anything else. She told him about the summer she'd expanded the bakery's hours and nearly burned herself out by October, and had spent an entire week doing nothing but watching television and eating cereal from the box, and how that week had felt like the best vacation she'd ever taken. He laughed at that, a real laugh, not the polite version. And she thought, not for the first time and not with any particular drama, that she was in a considerable amount of trouble. He walked her to her car. The air was January cold, sharp enough to make your eyes water, and she'd forgotten her gloves, which felt like a metaphor she declined to examine. He stood with her while she found her keys, and when she had them, he didn't immediately say goodnight, and she didn't immediately get in the car. This was good, he said, simple, no performance. It was, she agreed. I'd like to do it again. Okay, she said. He nodded, and she could see him physically resisting the urge to say more, to add something that would fill the space that didn't need filling. He'd gotten better at that, she thought, over the months of Saturdays. Or maybe he'd always been good at it, and she was only now paying close enough attention to notice. She got in the car and drove home. She sat in the driveway for 3 minutes before going inside, not thinking anything in particular, just sitting. It had been a long time since she'd needed to sit with something before she could bring it indoors. That felt, if nothing else, like important information. February moved the way Montana. Februaries always did, relentlessly, indifferently, with cold that settled into your joints and refused to leave until it was good and ready. Clara's bakery was warm, though, and the regulars came more faithfully in winter than any other season because cold and darkness made people want something with butter in it, and she could not argue with the logic. She and Silas had dinner again the third week of January, then again in early February. They settled into a rhythm that was easy without being careless. Saturdays at the bakery, where nothing had changed on the surface, and every few weeks something at Farley's or occasionally a different place, a small Italian spot outside of town that Silas had discovered because Pete's wife liked it and had recommended it with such persistence that he'd finally gone. Pete's wife, Clara learned, was a woman named Rosalind who had strong opinions about most things and was usually right, and who had apparently told Silas 6 months ago, well before Clara had been aware of it, that he needed to do something already before he talked himself out of something good. Silas relayed this with the expression of a man who had been mildly mortified and was only now able to find it funny. She said that? Clara asked. Word for word, Rosalind doesn't traffic in subtext. I like her. Everyone likes Rosalind. It's deeply inconvenient for people who want to be annoyed at her. Clara told Doris about the dinners, because not telling Doris would have been both futile and unkind, and Doris responded with exactly the restraint Clara had expected, which was none. Finally, Doris said, just that. Finally. Like she'd been waiting with her coat on. It's dinner, Clara said. It's just dinner. You've had dinner twice in the same decade with someone you actually like. That's not just dinner for you, Clara, and you know it. Clara knew it. She just wasn't ready to say so out loud, because saying things out loud had a way of making them real, and real things could be lost, and she'd lost enough things that the gap between not yet named and named still felt like it mattered. March arrived with mud season, which in that part of Montana was its own particular event, the snow melting into the ground faster than the ground could take it, turning roads into something between a road and a river. Silas drove into town anyway, every Saturday. Clara had stopped pretending to herself that she hadn't noticed. They were standing in her kitchen one afternoon. He'd come by to drop off another bag of the gala apples from the orchard, the last of what the cold storage held. She'd offered coffee. He'd stayed. And she was making a second batch of scones while they talked, because her hands needed something to do when conversations got to a certain density, and he was sitting at her kitchen table the way a person sits when they've been led into a space they know is not automatically available, carefully. I was telling her about one of his sons, the older one, Marcus, who was in Denver doing something in finance that Silas understood only in the broadest strokes and chose not to press too hard on, because Marcus had spent a significant portion of his adolescence being pressured by a father who hadn't known how to express worry except through demands, and they'd both grown enough to stop repeating the pattern. He calls more than he used to, Silas said. Not a lot more, but more. I take what I can get. When did you figure out you'd been too hard on him? I was quiet for a moment. Ellen told me, about 2 years before she got sick. She wasn't the type to let things build. She said, Silas, you're going to lose that boy if you keep treating his choices like they're personal affronts. He paused. She was right. I spent about a month being angry about being told, and then I called Marcus, and we had the most uncomfortable 20-minute conversation of my life, and then we had a better one after that. 20 minutes, Clara said. 23, actually, I counted. She looked at him. He was serious. He'd counted. That's the most you've mentioned her in one stretch, she said carefully. He noticed what she was doing, checking the perimeter, making sure the conversation didn't have a wire in it. I'm not using her as a wall, he said, or I'm trying not to. It's just, he turned his mug in his hands. 31 years is a lot of story. She's in most of it. I know, Clara said. She put the scones in the oven. Thomas is in a lot of mine. Different story. Not one I mostly want to tell. You don't have to. I know. That's why I'm saying it. He looked at her, and she recognized in his face the same thing she'd been carrying around for months. Not quite certainty, not quite fear, but the specific discomfort of arriving somewhere you'd told yourself you weren't going to arrive at again. Clara, he started. Her phone rang. Not a cell phone ring, the bakery's landline, which forwarded to her cell during off hours, which meant it was a supply order emergency or a catering inquiry that couldn't wait. She held up one finger, not apologetically, because she wasn't sorry. Her bakery came first, and he already knew that about her. She took the call. It was May, who was covering the Sunday morning prep and had discovered that the flour delivery had somehow been shorted by 3 25-pound bags. And did Clara want her to call the supplier or, I'll call, Clara said. Give me 10 minutes. When she hung up, Silas was already standing carrying his mug to the sink. Not in a hurt way, just reading the room. You don't have to go, she said. Your work calls, you answer it, he said. I know how that is. She watched him rinse the mug without being asked, set it beside the sink. He picked up his jacket from the chair. The thing you were about to say, she said. He stopped. Finish it, she said, quick. He turned around. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said quietly and without preamble, I'm not trying to get anywhere fast. I wanted to say I'm glad. That's all. For Saturdays and for dinner and for all of it. I'm glad it happened. She thought about that for a second. Me too, she said, and meant it in approximately 5 different directions at once. He nodded. He left. She called the flour supplier, and while she was on hold, she stood at the kitchen window and watched his truck go down the road. And she thought, without drama, and without dismissing it, this is real. Whatever this is, it's real. She hadn't thought that about anything in a very long time. April was better. The mud dried and the days got longer and the bakery had its spring surge, all the people who'd been eating soup all winter suddenly wanting something with lemon in it, which Clara was happy to provide. She'd added a lavender honey cake to the menu in March on a whim, and it had sold out every single day for 3 weeks running, which meant it was now a permanent fixture, which meant she needed to order more lavender, which led to a conversation with a local herb farmer that led to a regular arrangement that led to Doris declaring the whole thing a miracle of the local economy. Silas came every Saturday. He stayed longer when the bakery wasn't busy, shorter when it was, and she'd stopped reading anything particular into either because she'd realized he calibrated based on what she needed rather than what he wanted, and that this was simply how he moved through the world. The first Saturday of May, he wasn't there. She noticed at 10:30, which was earlier than she would have liked to admit. She told herself it meant nothing. He had a working ranch, things happened. Pete got hurt once the previous fall, and Silas had missed 2 Saturdays while covering the extra work. She sold apple pie to 4 other people. She smiled at all of them. She told herself the same thing several times in slightly different words, the way you do when the thing you're telling yourself isn't quite taking. The second Saturday of May, he still wasn't there. Clara closed the bakery at 2, which was normal. She sat in the kitchen for an hour and a half, which was not. She tried to think about whether she was overreacting, and the trying told her she wasn't, because if she were overreacting, she wouldn't need to argue herself into it. Something sat wrong in her chest, heavy and specific. The same weight she'd felt the morning her mother went into the hospital, and Clara hadn't known yet that she wouldn't come back out. She did not like that the comparison was her mother. She noted it anyway. She called Doris. Have you heard anything about the Mercer place? She asked, without preamble, because Doris knew everything about everyone within 30 miles and had never once pretended otherwise. A pause. Why? He missed 2 Saturdays. Clara. Doris, have you heard anything? Another pause, different in texture. I heard from Barbara Halverson. You know, Ed does that Christmas dinner thing, and Barbara hears things. That Pete called Ed last week asking if he knew a hand who could come out for a few weeks. Said Silas had an accident. Clara's hand tightened on the phone. What kind of accident? She didn't know the details, just that Pete needed help and was trying to keep it quiet, which is how things get loud in this town. Clara was already standing, which she hadn't entirely decided to do. Don't, Doris said. Don't what? Don't do the thing you're already planning to do. I'm not planning anything. Clara, you're planning something. I can hear it. She was. She hadn't told herself what it was yet, but she was. I'll call you later, she said, and hung up before Doris could register a more specific objection. She went home. She got the truck, which she preferred to her car for longer drives because it handled better on the back roads. She called Pete's cell number. She had it because Silas had given it to her in February in case she ever needed to reach him when the cell service went out near the ranch, which it sometimes did. Pete answered on the fourth ring. He sounded tired in a way that was several days deep. Pete, it's Clara Winslow. A beat. Yes, ma'am. Is he okay? Another beat, long enough that her stomach dropped. He's alive, ma'am. Had a bad fall off the upper fence line 3 weeks back. The horse spooked and he came down wrong and there was an infection. Doc Harlan came out twice. It's been a rough few weeks. Who's with him? I'm here during the day. The nights, Pete stopped. He's alone at night. Silence, which was its own answer. Clara was already calculating the drive. 6 miles past the Callaway Road, which from her house was about 40 minutes on a clear day. The roads were dry. The evening was long. Pete, she said, I'm coming out. Ma'am, I'm not asking. I'm telling you so you can have the front gate unlocked. She heard him exhale, something between resignation and relief. Yes, ma'am, he said. I'll let him know. Don't, she said. I'd rather he couldn't talk himself out of it before I get there. There was a pause, and then Pete said very quietly, He's not going to turn you away. No, Clara said, he's not. She packed a bag in 8 minutes. Not because she planned to stay, she told herself, but because she was practical and prepared. And if she needed to stay, she would stay, and she'd rather not have to think about it twice. She put in the tin of shortbread she'd made that morning because her hands had needed something to do before she'd known yet what they were doing it for. She put in her kit for the kitchen, which she took whenever she went anywhere that might involve cooking for more than herself. She drove through the evening, and it was the kind of May evening Montana occasionally threw at you like a dare. The light at that particular gold angle that hit the fields and the hills and made everything look like something worth keeping. She didn't pay attention to it the way she normally would. Her mind was already 6 miles past the Callaway Road. The gate was open. The ranch house was exactly what she'd imagined, and also nothing like what she'd imagined. Large enough to have been built with a family in mind, old enough to show it, kept up but not fussed over. A working house. The kind that had been cleaned because it needed cleaning, not because appearances were the point. Pete's truck was parked by the barn. A light was on in what she guessed was the main room. She knocked. Pete opened the door almost immediately, which meant he'd been watching for her, which said something. He was in his 60s, compact and weathered, with the kind of face that had stopped making much distinction between concern and neutrality. He's in the back room, Pete said. He's been sitting up some today. Fever broke 2 days ago, but he's still... He made a gesture that communicated not right without saying it directly. He doesn't know yet. That you're here. Okay, Clara said. She followed Pete through the house, which smelled like wood and old coffee and something antiseptic underneath both. The living room had a bookcase stuffed without particular organization and a chair that had clearly been used so consistently it had taken on the shape of the person who sat in it, and 2 framed photographs on the side table that she didn't stop to look at, because that wasn't why she was here. Pete stopped at the hallway and pointed. Second door, he said, and turned back toward the kitchen without waiting, which was, she thought, a remarkably tactful thing for a man who seemed to specialize in the direct. She walked to the second door, knocked once. Pete, I said, I'm fine. The voice was rougher than she'd heard it, scraped down to something raw, and under the words was the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been saying I'm fine for 3 weeks and was getting tired of it even as they kept saying it. It's not Pete, Clara said. Silence. Then, Clara. Not a question, just her name, like he was checking that he was still awake. She opened the door. He looked worse than she'd braced for. That was the honest truth of it. Silas Mercer, who occupied space without trying to, who had a quality of solidity that she'd thought of more than once when she needed the concept of something immovable. He was thin in a way. 3 weeks makes a man, the kind of thin that isn't diet. And his color was still wrong, too pale in some places and too hot-looking in others. And he was propped up against the headboard with the expression of a man who had been alone long enough to have made a full accounting of everything he should have done differently and hadn't gotten through the full list yet. He looked at her, then he looked at the bag in her hand, then back at her. "You drove all the way out here," he said. 40 minutes, she said. "Barely counts." "Clara, Pete says the fever broke 2 days ago." "It did." "But you haven't eaten properly." "I've eaten." "Pete told me what you've been eating, and it doesn't count." She set the bag down on the chair by the door. "I'm going to make something. You're going to eat it. That's the whole plan." He looked at her in a way she couldn't read for a second, and then something in his face shifted. Not to gratitude, not exactly, but to something older than gratitude. Something that happened when you'd been alone with something hard for long enough that the presence of another person landed differently than it would have before. "You didn't have to come," he said, and it didn't sound like he was trying to send her away. It sounded like he was still processing the fact that she had. "I know," she said. "That's why I came." She went to the kitchen and Pete, without being asked, without discussion, showed her where things were and then left. She didn't know where he went. She didn't need to. She found the soup pot and what was in the pantry, and she made something that wasn't a recipe, just what she knew how to make with her hands when someone needed to eat, and she couldn't think of anything else useful to do. Onions and garlic, and what broth there was, and carrots, and the dried herbs from the second shelf, and she stood over it and stirred it and listened to the house, which was the quiet of a house that had been quiet too long. She brought him a bowl. He ate all of it, slowly, without comment, and when he finished, she took the bowl back and sat down in the chair. "How bad was it?" she asked. "The infection." Bad enough that Doc Harlan used the word serious twice in one sentence. That's how doctors tell you they're scared without saying they're scared. I figured. He looked at the window. I kept thinking, there were a few days where I wasn't entirely. The fever was pretty high, and I kept thinking about things I hadn't said. She waited. He looked at her. "I thought about you," he said. "That's what I want to tell you. That when I was in that bed, not sure which way it was going to go, you were what I thought about. I'm not trying to make it into something big. I'm just telling you the truth because you drove 40 minutes without being asked, and you made me soup, and I think you deserve the truth." Clara sat very still. "I'm not entirely sure what to do with that," she said finally. "Neither am I." He said it without apology. But there it is. She stayed until 9. She left the shortbread tin on the kitchen counter and the rest of the soup on the stove with instructions written on a piece of paper. Heat at medium. Don't let it boil. Eat it. In the specific way she wrote instructions when she needed to feel useful and didn't want to examine why too closely. Pete walked her to her truck. "He's going to be all right," Pete said, in the tone of a man saying a thing he needs to say out loud to keep believing it. "I know," Clara said. He's not good at accepting help." "I noticed." "He's better about it than he was." Pete paused. "Since you came around, he's better about a few things." She looked at Pete, who was looking at the truck, not at her. She thought about Rosalind, who had told Silas to do something already. She thought about the small ecosystem of people who had been watching this quietly and worrying about him in the way you worry about someone you've known long enough to know where they're fragile. "I'll come back Thursday," she said, "if the roads are clear." "I'll make sure the gate's open," Pete said. She drove home in the dark with the window cracked because she needed the cold air to think, except she didn't exactly think. She just drove, and somewhere around the halfway point she admitted to herself that she'd packed that bag knowing she might stay. Not because she'd planned it, but because some part of her had known and hadn't bothered to argue. She wasn't sure what to call that part. She wasn't sure she needed to name it yet. She came back Thursday. She came back the following Monday. She brought food both times, and the second time Silas was sitting in the kitchen when she arrived rather than the back room, which Pete told her was the most progress he'd seen. And Silas told Pete that was an exaggeration, and Pete said it wasn't, and they had the bickering familiarity of two men who had worked together for 15 years and knew each other too well for pretense. She sat with Silas at the kitchen table while he ate, and they talked the way they'd talked in the bakery. in pieces, unhurried, letting the silences be silences instead of filling them. He told her about the accident, the details now that he could tell them without the fear under them. The horse had been startled by a coyote. The fall had happened fast. And the worst part hadn't been the pain, but the 30 minutes of trying to get back to the house on his own, while running the calculation of whether he was going to make it. "You made it," she said. "I made it. Took me 3 hours to get to the phone." She thought about that. 3 hours. Alone. Pete should have a way to check in more regularly. Pete's got his own place to manage. I'm not saying Pete did anything wrong. I'm saying the system is bad. One person, 6 miles from anywhere, with seasonal help and no check-in protocol. Clara. He said her name with a patient quality that she recognized as him trying to be diplomatic about the fact that she was organizing his life without technically being invited to. "I'm making an observation," she said. "You're writing a safety plan in your head." "I might be." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face she'd been seeing more of lately, since the hospital days, since the fever broke. A quality of looking that felt different from the careful, measured thing he'd been doing for months. Less defended, maybe. Like some of the distance had been burned off in the 3 weeks he'd spent alone with his own thoughts in that back room. "I don't know how to do this," he said suddenly. "I want to say that. I know how to work a ranch, and I know how to be a husband. I knew how with Ellen, but I grew into it. I was 24 when we met, and we had time to figure it out together before it got to anything hard." He stopped. "I'm 56 years old, and I don't know the first thing about doing this at 56. Whatever this is." Clara looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. "I'm 51, and I married the wrong person, and spent 7 years learning what love isn't. So." She shrugged, a small one. "We're both starting from incomplete information." "That's one way to put it." "It's the accurate way to put it." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Are you scared?" She considered lying. "Yes," she said instead. "Of what specifically?" "Of needing something," she said. "Of adjusting my whole life around something and then having it go." He nodded slowly, like that landed where it should. "Ellen and I used to argue about whether it was better to have 31 years and lose it or to have never had it at all." He paused. "We never agreed. I think I changed my answer after she was gone." "Which way?" "I'll let you know," he said, "when I'm more certain." That was the most he had ever said to her in that direction, the closest he'd come to saying something without saying it, and she sat with it the drive home. She sat with it the next morning, making bread. She sat with it for 3 days, turning it over the way you turn over something you're not ready to put down and not ready to hold properly yet either. The 3rd Saturday of May, Silas walked into the bakery. He walked carefully, the way someone walks when they're not quite trusting their body yet, and he was thinner than he'd been in January, and he was using the shoulder she'd seen Pete favoring last time as a visual cue to remember not to favor it. But he was upright. He was in his usual jacket. He was carrying himself in the specific way that said, "I drove 40 minutes to be here, and I would do it again." He ordered apple pie and black coffee, same as always. He sat at the corner table. May appeared beside Clara at the counter, silent, and Clara handed her the coffee pot and nodded at the corner table without saying a word. May, who had been working there long enough to understand everything without being told, carried both plates and the coffee to the corner table, set them down, and walked back to the kitchen without once letting her expression do anything visible. Clara waited until the morning rush had settled, until the bakery was the quiet of mid-morning with only a few lingerers and the sound of the oven doing its work. Then she walked to the corner table and sat down across from him. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You drove 40 minutes, she said. "I wasn't missing another Saturday," he said. She pushed the pie plate half an inch closer to him, which was not a grand gesture and wasn't meant to be. "An 8. She sat. Outside, the May sun did whatever it was going to do, and the town moved around them the way towns do, without asking for permission or pausing for significance. And in the corner booth of Clara's bakery on a Saturday in the last part of spring, 2 people sat together in a silence that wasn't empty. That was the furthest thing from empty. That was in fact so full it didn't need a single word added to it to mean what it meant. He came back the next Saturday, and the one after that. By June, Silas had regained most of the weight he'd lost, and the color that had gone wrong during the infection had mostly corrected itself. Though there were mornings, Pete told Clara later, where you could still see it, a kind of careful quality to how he moved, the body remembering what the mind was trying to set aside. He pushed himself too hard the second week of June, which Pete told Clara about and Silas did not. And Clara found out only because she'd driven out on a Thursday, and Pete had met her at the gate with the expression of a man relieved to have someone else who could say the thing he'd been saying all week without it landing. He went back up to the upper fence line, Pete said. Alone. Clara looked at him. I know, Pete said. She went inside and found Silas in the kitchen, moving fine on the surface, and she sat down and said nothing for a moment and then said, Pete told me. Pete talks too much. Pete is the only reason you're not still in that back room with a fever of 103, she said, and you know that. He set down his mug. I know that. Then stop making his job harder. I was quiet for a moment, which was not the same as agreeing, and she knew the difference, but it was close enough for the time being. She made dinner. He ate it. They sat on the porch afterward because the June evenings out past the Callaway Road had a particular quality, the light going long and gold across the fields, the air cooling in layers, and she'd started noticing things like that more than she used to, or maybe noticing them in relation to where she was rather than just in general. She was aware, in a way she was trying not to make too large, that she was sitting on a porch at a ranch 6 miles from nowhere with a man she'd known for 8 months, and that it felt more like a Thursday evening than an event. She was aware that the feeling of something feeling ordinary was its own kind of information. They talked about his younger son that evening, the one she'd heard less about, whose name was Garrett, and who lived in Seattle and worked in something environmental, land conservation, or resource management, and who had called twice during the worst of the illness, which Silas had told him about only after the fact, which had resulted in a conversation that had covered a lot of ground, including some old ground neither of them had planned to revisit that week. He said, I need to stop trying to manage everything alone, Silas said. He's right, Clara said. I know he's right. You're very good at knowing people are right and then continuing to do the thing anyway. He looked at her with something between amusement and the particular expression of a man who has been accurately described and isn't sure whether to appreciate it or object to it. You've noticed that. It's hard to miss. Ellen used to say the same thing. He said it without weight, without using it as a wall, just true. The way true things kept being true. She said I was the most frustratingly self-sufficient man she'd ever met, and that she loved me in spite of it, emphasis on the in spite of. Clara thought about that. She sounds like she was very patient. Selective patience, he said. She had no patience for anything she considered nonsense, but she had a lot of patience for people she decided were worth it. A pause. She was better at deciding who was worth it than I ever was. The evening settled around them without either of them pushing it anywhere, and Clara drove home at 9 with the windows down and the road lit ahead of her, and the faint smell of the fields coming through the dark. And she thought, not dramatically, not with any fanfare, that she was happy right now. Not the big happiness, not the kind you could point at, the quiet kind, the kind that sat in the body rather than announcing itself, the kind she'd spent enough years without that she'd learned to recognize it when it showed up in small forms. She thought, don't crowd it. She didn't. Summer moved through the way summers do in Montana. Fast when you're in it and enormous in retrospect. The bakery did well. The lavender honey cake became something people from neighboring towns started driving in for, which she hadn't anticipated and which required her to triple the order with the herb farmer, a man named Gerald, who was so pleased about the development that he showed up one morning with an additional bundle of dried lavender as a gesture of professional solidarity. May's hours expanded from part-time to something that was almost full-time without either of them formally deciding on it. Clara hired a second part-time person, a retired school teacher named Nora, who turned out to have exceptional bread instincts and absolutely zero ability to make change from a 20 without a calculator, and they worked around it. Doris came in every Tuesday and Friday, same as always, and required no update because she was apparently receiving information through some other channel because she said things like, I heard he was back in the saddle by mid-June, without ever explaining how she'd come to know that. Clara and Silas fell into a rhythm that neither of them named but both of them maintained. Saturdays at the bakery, Thursdays at the ranch. When the week cooperated, the occasional Friday dinner somewhere that was slightly nicer than Farley's without being the kind of place where you felt like you needed to perform anything. They talked every few days on the phone, which had started during his recovery when she'd wanted to know he was upright and had continued past the point of necessity into habit, which was its own kind of statement. They had not, by any formal reckoning, defined what they were. Clara had not been eager to define it. Silas had not pushed. The word relationship existed somewhere in the vicinity of what they were doing without either of them being willing to pick it up and hand it directly to the other. And that had felt fine, not because they were avoiding something, but because, for both of them, the shape of a thing had to be clear before you named it, and the shape was still forming. Danny called in July. Her son, the lawyer, the one she talked to every few weeks in their particular shorthand of managed affection and shared history. He was good at his work, and occasionally too certain he was right about things adjacent to his work. And Clara loved him in the specific, complicated way you love someone who came from you and is irrevocably themselves. "Rachel says you're seeing someone," Danny said. "Rachel talks too much." She mentioned it very carefully, actually. She said you seemed different and that she thought you might be seeing someone and that she was trying not to make a whole thing about it. She made a whole thing about it. She told me, and I'm making a whole thing about it. She just made a small thing about it. Clara moved the phone to her other ear and sat down at the kitchen table. "I am seeing someone. It's not at a stage where there's a lot to report. Good seeing someone or complicated seeing someone?" "Both," she said honestly. "Because of Thomas?" "No." She said it without hesitation and meant it. "Not because of Thomas. Because of me. Because I'm 51. And I built something I'm not interested in disrupting, and I'm figuring out what it means to want something without being afraid of what it costs." A pause. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me about your personal life in about 4 years. Don't push it." "I'm not pushing anything. I'm just... Are you okay?" "Not the bakery, not Rachel, not me. You." She thought about the porch at the ranch, the June evenings, the sitting on a Thursday night that felt like nothing and felt like everything. "I think so," she said. "I think I might actually be okay." Danny didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was quieter. "Good," he said. "That's all I needed." She sat with the phone after she'd hung up, not on it, just with it, the way you sit with something that moved you more than you expected it to. Her son asking, "Are you okay?" Just her. Not the bakery, not the family. Her. She hadn't realized until he said it how long it had been since someone had asked it that specifically. She thought about calling Silas and then decided not to. Not because she didn't want to, but because she wanted to sit with the feeling of the conversation for a little while before she brought it anywhere. She sat with it for an evening and then she was fine. The trouble, when it came quietly. That was the thing about trouble that knew how to wait. It didn't announce itself. It arrived in an ordinary moment, and only afterward did you understand that the ordinary moment had been the dividing line. It was the 3rd week of July. She'd come to the ranch on a Thursday as usual, earlier than usual, because the bakery had been slow, and May had offered to close up, and Clara had let her, which she was still not entirely sure she felt right about, but had decided to be practical about. She'd brought supplies because there were things in the garden that needed dealing with. Silas had planted a kitchen garden the spring before that had gotten away from him while he was recovering and had been catching up ever since, and she'd volunteered to help manage it without quite being invited to, which was something she recognized in herself as a pattern, finding the useful thing and doing it before anyone could argue. She was in the garden when he came back from the east field. She heard the truck, heard him get out, heard Pete say something she couldn't catch, and then heard Silas walk toward the house. She straightened up with her hands full of zucchini that had gotten to the size where you stopped wanting to know how and turned around, and he was standing at the edge of the garden watching her. He looked tired. The field kind of tired, the kind that sat on you physically, not the other kind. He'd been working the ranch harder since he'd recovered. She'd noticed it. Pete had noticed it. They'd both not said much about it because there was no easy way to tell a man that you thought he was working hard because the work was easier than the thinking. "Early day," he said. May closed up. "Don't make a thing of it." He almost smiled. He came closer and looked at what she'd done with the garden, which was better organized than it had been and would produce more reliably for it. Something crossed his face, something she didn't have a name for immediately and cataloged to examine later. "You're good at that," he said. "I'm good at most things that involve patience and planning." "You are." He said it like he was saying something else at the same time, and she looked at him, and his expression had shifted into something that she recognized in retrospect as a man who had been thinking about something for weeks, and had arrived at the moment where he was going to say it before he talked himself out of it. "Clara," he said, I've been thinking about what makes sense, practically, about you driving back and forth, and the amount of time that gets wasted in transit, and the ranch." He paused, reorganizing. "This place is too much for Pete and me, especially after this spring. And you're here half the week anyway, and the bakery practically runs itself now with May and Nora, and it just seems—" He stopped again. "What does it seem?" she said carefully. "The ranch needs someone," he said. "With management, with the house. You're good at it. You can see it yourself. What you've done with the garden in an afternoon, the way you organized the kitchen the first night you came out here. The place needs that." She stood very still with the zucchini in her hands. "The ranch needs someone," she said. "Yes." "You want me to—" "What?" "Move out here. Because the ranch needs managing." He heard it then. She watched it land. He opened his mouth and she saw him understand. Not all of it, not the weight of the whole history of it, but enough. The wrong word, the wrong framing, and not just wrong, but specifically, precisely, the wrong thing to say to this specific woman, and she could see him reaching for the correction even as the damage was already done. "That's not— I meant it differently than—" "I know what you meant," she said. Her voice was even. "That was the thing about the old machinery, the thing Thomas had built in her across 7 years of being valued for her usefulness and not herself. It didn't need a dramatic trigger. It just needed the right word in the right shape, and the ranch needs someone was shaped exactly right." She set the zucchini down on the garden border. She didn't throw it. She just set it down, deliberately, the way you set something down when you need your hands free and you need the gesture to say what you're not going to say out loud. "Clara, I need to go," she said. "Please don't go. I didn't mean—" "I know you didn't mean it the way it came out," she said, and she believed it, which made it almost worse because she could have held on to anger if she hadn't believed it. "But you said it, and I need to go home." He stepped toward her, and she took a step back. Not dramatic, just back, creating the necessary distance. "Not because of the ranch. I'm asking you because I cut—" "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't finish that sentence right now. Don't try to put something good right on top of something you just said, because I'll spend the rest of the night not knowing which one I'm supposed to believe." He stood there. She could see the effort it was taking him not to push, not to fill the space with explanation, and she was aware enough, even in the moment, even with the machinery running, to know that the restraint was not nothing. "I'll call you," she said. She walked to her truck. She drove home. She did not cry until she was inside with the door closed, and even then it wasn't the specific cry of heartbreak. It was the older cry, the one that had been waiting since before Silas Mercer, the one that came from the accumulated weight of being a woman who people kept trying to fit into the shape of what they needed. She sat in her kitchen for an hour. She thought about her mother, who had worked herself into the ground, managing a diner that technically belonged to her father and had never once been asked what she wanted to do with the place. She thought about Thomas, who had spoken of her talents the way a man speaks of a good appliance, reliably, proprietarily, without recognition that the appliance had a self underneath the function. She thought about the loan she'd gotten on her own, the building she'd bought on her own, the sign above the door that said Clara's because every other inch of her life had said someone else's name. She was not going to become the thing that ran Silas Mercer's ranch. She was not angry at him in the bottomless way she realized after an hour. She was angry at the sentence. She was angry at the phrasing, at the word needs, at the specific architecture of what he'd said and what it echoed. But the anger had a floor. She could feel the floor, which was different from the anger she'd carried after Thomas, which had had no floor for years, which had just dropped into something that had taken a long time to climb out of. The fact that this anger had a floor told her something. She wasn't sure yet whether it made things better or harder. She didn't call him that night. She didn't call him the next day either, which was a Friday, and she spent the Friday in the bakery with the particular focused quality she got when she needed her hands to do something her head couldn't. She made 3 batches of the lavender honey cake, which was 2 more than she needed, and May looked at the cakes and then at Clara and said nothing, which was the right call. Doris came in at 11 and sat at the counter and ordered coffee she didn't need and looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who had been told something or intuited something or simply lived long enough to read rooms the way other people read books. "Do you want to talk about it?" Doris said. "No." "Do you want me to sit here while you don't talk about it?" Clara looked at her. Doris looked back. "Yes," Clara said. Doris drank her unnecessary coffee and stayed until 1. And when she left, she patted Clara's hand once on the counter, just once, with the specific economy of a 72-year-old woman who had lived enough life to know that sometimes the hand pat was the whole thing. The weekend was hard in the dull way, not the sharp way. The hard where everything works and nothing is wrong, technically, and you're just aware of an absence that you haven't decided anything about yet. She went through the motions. The bakery opened and closed. She ate dinner. She called Rachel Sunday evening and talked for 40 minutes about the twins, who were going through a phase of inventing words that they expected everyone else to learn. And Rachel was both exhausted and delighted by it, and Clara laughed in real places and meant it. She checked her phone on Sunday night. Silas had texted once, Saturday afternoon. It said, "I'm sorry. Take the time you need. I mean that." She read it 3 times. She didn't respond. She set the phone down and picked it back up and set it down again. He had not said "I'm sorry," I just meant. He had said "I'm sorry," and then told her to take the time she needed and meant it. She did not call him on Monday. She did call Doris on Monday, which was not a bakery day, which meant it was purely social, which was relatively unusual. He apologized, Clara said, without preamble. How? 1 sentence, "I'm sorry. Take the time you need." A pause. "That's a good apology," Doris said. "I know. A bad apologizer makes it about themselves, makes it into an explanation. He didn't do that." "I know. Are you angry at him, or are you angry at the pattern?" Clara looked at her kitchen wall. The good Doris questions were always the ones she'd already been turning over. "Both," she said. "Neither, separately. Both at the same time." "That's harder," Doris said, "when it's not clean." "Nothing's ever been clean." "No," Doris agreed, "but sometimes clean would be nice." She thought about it all week. She was honest with herself about what she was thinking, which was not always what she was doing during Thomas, where she'd spent years talking herself out of what she saw clearly. This was different. She could see clearly, and the clarity said he'd said a careless, painful thing, and he'd known it immediately, and he hadn't chased, and he hadn't explained, and he hadn't made her feel like her reaction was the problem. She could also see she'd built walls so specifically shaped by her own history that sometimes the walls caught things that weren't aimed at them. Both of those things were true at the same time. She sat with both of them. She didn't try to decide which one was more true, because that wasn't the right question. The right question was, what did she want to do? On Thursday, exactly 1 week after she'd driven home from the ranch and set the zucchini down on the garden border, she called him. He picked up on the second ring. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said, quiet. Not performing relief, though she could hear it underneath. "I want to say something, and I want you to let me say all of it before you respond. Okay? What you said hurt. Not because you're a bad person, but because it hit something specific and old, and I don't think you knew it was there, and I don't think you meant to hit it, but it was there, and it got hit, and I needed the week." I didn't say anything. She'd asked him not to, and he wasn't. "The thing I keep coming back to," she said, "is that I don't want to be somebody's solution. I spent a lot of years being somebody's solution, and it takes something from you. It takes the part that believes you're worth choosing for yourself instead of for what you do." She heard him breathing, careful. "I've been thinking about what I want," she said. "And I know what I want. I want the bakery, my bakery, fully mine the way it is now. And I want—" She stopped, organized, started again. "I want to know that what you want is me. Not the garden, not the house management. Me, the actual person, with all the inconvenient parts." He was quiet for a moment after she stopped. She'd given him permission to respond by stopping. "You," he said. "The inconvenient parts specifically. The woman who ran a flower supplier at 7 in the morning without looking anything up first and was right. The woman who drove 40 minutes without being asked because Pete told her I hadn't eaten right. The woman who set the zucchini down on the garden border instead of throwing it at me, which I probably deserved." He paused. "I said it wrong. I know I said it wrong. But I want you to know that the reason I said it, the reason I was thinking about logistics and proximity and all of those careful, practical things, is because the thing I was trying not to say, because I thought it was too soon or too much or would crowd you, was that I love you." A pause, very short. "That's the thing I've been working around. I love you, and I didn't want to say it like a pressure, so I said something practical. And practical was the wrong language." She sat in her kitchen with the phone against her ear. "Well," she said after a moment. "Yeah," he said. She stopped, started. That's a harder thing to respond to than I was prepared for. You don't have to respond to it right now. I know. She looked at her hands on the table. Baker's hands, 51 years of her own decisions in them. I'm not saying it back right now. Not because I'm just not ready to say it yet. Okay, he said. And it was okay. She could hear that it was okay. Can I come Thursday? She said. The gate'll be open, he said. She did not say I love you back that Thursday. She came out and they sat on the porch and ate the dinner she'd made and talked about the ranch and the bakery and Marcus, who had called Silas the previous week and stayed on the phone for almost an hour, which was a record. And Silas had told him about the fall and Marcus had been quiet for a long time and then said, "Why didn't you call me?" And Silas had said, "Because I'm working on it." And Marcus had said, "Work faster," which was the most direct thing he'd said to his father in probably 15 years. And Silas had been both proud of him and completely ambushed by it. "He sounds like you," Clara said. "God help him," Silas said. She stayed until 8. She came back the following Thursday. And the one after that. She didn't say it back in July. She didn't say it in August either, which she was aware of in the way you're aware of a word you're not saying, the shape of it in your mouth that you keep choosing not to release. She thought about it. She was honest with herself about why she wasn't saying it. Some of it was old caution, the walls, the wiring. Some of it was something else. A woman who had learned the hard way that the saying of it changed things, made things real, made them losable in a way they weren't when they were still in the process of forming. Some of it was that she wanted to be sure. Not about him. She'd been sure about him for months in the way you're sure about something once you stop arguing with what you see. She wanted to be sure about herself, about whether she could hold the thing without letting it hollow out the other things, without letting love become the gravitational center that pulled everything else into orbit around someone else's life. She needed to know she could have both, not half of each. Both. It was the last week of August when the phone call came that she had not been expecting and would spend a long time afterward trying to understand whether she'd been afraid of it or whether she'd simply never let herself picture it concretely enough to be afraid. It was Danny. "Mom," he said, and she knew from the single word that it wasn't a regular call. "I need to talk to you about something." He'd been at a meeting, he said. A professional meeting, a mediation, something she didn't need the full details of. But one of the parties involved had been a property developer out of Billings. And in the course of the research he'd done for the case, Danny had come across something. A record. A filing. "Someone has been looking at your building," Danny said. "The bakery building. I found a letter of intent filed with the county from a development group." Clara sat down. "My building. It's yours. Legally, completely yours. I'm not saying, but they've expressed interest, which means they've been approaching property in that block, which means someone's been scoping the area." "Who filed it?" A pause. "The group is called Meridian Realty Holdings. But Mom, the contact name on the local filing, the person representing the interest locally." He stopped. "Danny. It's Kevin Marsh," he said. "He's a property manager out of Billings. He's also the husband of Tracy Marsh." Another pause. "Who is, from what I can find, Thomas's cousin." The kitchen was very quiet. "Thomas's cousin," Clara said. "I don't know if it's connected. It could be entirely coincidental, but I thought you needed to know." She thanked him. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table with the same quality of stillness she'd had the day she'd walked into the courthouse and understood that this was going to be her life now, the reinventing, the starting again. She thought about the sign above the door, Clara's. Her name, her building, her loan paid off in full. She thought about a property developer filing a letter of intent. She thought about Thomas, who she hadn't thought about with any real weight in over a year, now sitting at the edge of her kitchen like an old smell coming through a wall you thought was sealed. She picked up her phone. She almost called Silas. She stopped. She sat with the fact that she'd almost called Silas. The almost calling was its own kind of information, that he was the person she wanted to tell, the person she would bring it to, that the bakery and the threat to the bakery was something she wanted to carry toward him rather than away from him. She sat with that for a long time in the last of the August evening. Then she called him. He picked up on the second ring, same as always. "Clara, something's happened," she said. "Nothing catastrophic yet, but I need to tell you about it." "Okay," he said, and he said it in exactly the way she needed. Not alarmed, not immediately solution-focused, just present. Just, "Okay, I'm here, tell me." She told him. He listened without interrupting, which he was good at. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds, which was not a nothing silence, but a thinking one. "What do you want to do?" he said. Not, "What should we do?" Not, "Here's what you should do." What do you want to do? She closed her eyes for a second. "I want to protect it," she said. "The bakery. Whatever it takes. I built it, and it's mine, and I'm not going to lose it to a letter of intent from someone who married into Thomas Winslow's family." "Okay," he said again. "I don't know what the right legal move is yet. Danny's looking into it. Do you need anything from me right now?" She thought about it. The real answer. "No," she said. "Not right now. I just needed you to know." "I know," he said. "I'm glad you called." She said goodnight. She hung up. She sat in the kitchen until 10, thinking through the bakery, the building, the lease structure, the ownership records, all the things she knew and all the things she'd need to know better. The fear was there. She wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. But it was the functional fear, the kind that sharpened you instead of paralyzed you, the kind she'd been running on since she was 19. She went to bed. She slept better than she'd expected to. In the morning, she opened the bakery at 7, same as every morning. She unlocked the door and turned the sign and stood for a second in the early light looking at her building. The painted window, the hand-lettered sign above the door, the particular brick of the front wall that had cost her 3 arguments with the contractor because she'd wanted it pointed properly and he'd wanted to do it fast. Clara's, her name, her building, her life, built from the floor up with her own hands. Whatever was coming, and something was coming, she could feel the shape of it, the way you feel weather before it arrives. She was going to meet it standing in the door of the thing she'd built. That much she was certain of. Danny called back 2 days later with more. He'd spent the intervening time doing what Clara had always privately thought her son was genuinely built for, the kind of methodical, patient excavation of paperwork that most people found deadening, but that Danny approached with something close to pleasure. The satisfaction of a man who trusted documents more than people and had rarely been proven wrong in that preference. "Meridian Realty Holdings isn't large," he said. "They've done 4 acquisitions in the last 3 years, all in smaller Montana towns, all commercial blocks in downtown areas. They come in, buy 2 or 3 properties, renovate them into something generic, lease them to chain tenants. The kind of places that look the same in every town. And Kevin Marsh is their local representative. He's done 3 of the 4 acquisitions for them as their regional contact. He's good at it. He knows which county offices to file with. He knows the local zoning people. He's not the money, he's the access." Danny paused. "Mom, I want to be careful here. The connection to Thomas through Tracy. I can't tell you that's meaningful. It might be pure coincidence that his wife is Thomas's cousin." "It might be," Clara said, "but you don't think it is." She thought about Thomas, who she had not thought about with any real weight since the previous spring, who had nevertheless remained present in the architecture of her life. The way a badly healed bone remains present, not always noticeable, but there when the weather changed. Thomas, who had never once accepted that something was simply over, who had spent 3 years after the divorce sending Danny and Rachel oblique messages that Clara chose not to examine too closely, who had the specific quality of a man who considered any outcome he hadn't controlled to be a temporary condition awaiting correction. I don't know what I think," she said, which was more honest than no. "I know I want the building protected. What do I need to do? The letter of intent is just interest. It has no legal force. They can't do anything to your building without your participation. You own it outright." Danny's voice had the careful quality he used when he was about to say something he knew she might resist. "But if you wanted to make it structurally harder for anyone to approach it in the future, there are some options. A conservation easement tied to commercial use. Or, simplest, you could put it into an LLC that you own and control entirely, which creates a layer between you personally and any approach. Would that work? It makes things more complicated for anyone trying to pressure you into a sale. It doesn't prevent someone from asking, but it changes the conversation. Do it," she said. "Walk me through what I need to sign." He did. It took 4 phone calls over the following week, 2 notarized documents, and a trip to the county office that she made on a Tuesday morning before the bakery opened, standing at the counter in her coat with the paperwork in her hand, watching the clerk stamp it with the specific pleasure of a woman who had learned to find satisfaction in official stamps. She told Silas that same Tuesday evening. She drove out to the ranch, not a scheduled Thursday, just a Tuesday, because she needed to tell someone who wasn't her son or Doris, and who would understand what it meant without needing it translated. I was in the kitchen when she arrived, which was becoming a familiar thing. The light on, the door unlocked because Pete had stopped locking it after Clara started coming regularly, and the locking had started to feel, in Pete's words, counterproductive. Silas had been going through ranch accounts at the kitchen table, which he did on Tuesday evenings, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who was always aware that he was slightly pleased to see her and was still, after all these months, slightly surprised by the consistency of it. She sat down and told him about the LLC, about Danny's research, about the letter of intent, and Kevin Marsh and the whole shape of it. He listened the way he listened, without interruption, without the instinct to immediately produce a solution that some men couldn't suppress, just with attention that was genuinely full rather than performative. When she finished, he said, "You already handled it. Danny helped. Danny gave you the options. You made the decisions." She looked at him. "Is that relevant?" "It's just true," he said. "I'm not making a point. He leaned back in his chair. "I noticed that about you, the way you move toward a problem. Most people move away first and then have to turn around. You just go." She didn't know what to do with that, so she filed it away to look at later. "I don't know yet if Thomas is actually behind any of it," she said. "It might be nothing. Coincidence. It might be. But I'm not going to sit and wait to find out while someone files paperwork around me." "No," Silas said, with complete equanimity. "You're not." She stayed for dinner. He made something out of the refrigerator that was not technically a recipe but was edible, which she had come to understand was the range of his cooking. Functional without ambition, which she respected because at least it was honest. She ate it without comment on its construction. He knew she was refraining from comment. Neither of them said anything about it. After dinner, she helped him with the ranch accounts. Not because he'd asked, but because she could see he was behind, and because numbers were numbers, and a ranch's operating costs weren't structurally different from a bakery's in the ways that mattered. He let her, which meant he was getting better at that, at the letting, at not performing the self-sufficiency quite so hard when someone capable was sitting across the table offering to be useful. They worked until 9. She drove home in the September dark. She thought about what Danny had said about Thomas, the careful it might be coincidence, and she thought about Thomas himself, and she realized that what she felt when she thought about him was not the old fear, the bone-deep fear from the marriage, the kind that had taken years to fully metabolize. What she felt now was something more like cold clarity. He was someone she had survived. The bakery was something she had built after. The two things existed in sequence, and the sequence meant something. She was not going to let the first thing diminish the second. The next week, she did something she had been thinking about for over a year and had not done for reasons that were partly practical and partly about not being ready to want it out loud yet. She called the number she had for the empty building on Callister Street. It had been empty for 14 months, a former hardware store that had closed when the owner retired and his son, who'd moved to Phoenix 15 years ago, had been intermittently trying to figure out what to do with it. It was twice the size of her current bakery space. It had a loading dock in the back, which she'd coveted in a low-grade way since the day she'd noticed it. It had windows across the front that got the morning light in a way her current space didn't. She had walked past it approximately 400 times and told herself it wasn't the right moment. The son's name was Walter Briggs, and he answered the phone in the distracted way of a man who had been managing a property from 2 states away for over a year and was tired of it. She introduced herself. "Clara's Bakery?" he said. "On Sycamore?" "That's me. My mother used to go there." A pause, and she heard something shift in his voice. Not sentimentality exactly, but the thing adjacent to it, the thing that happens when a place becomes part of someone's story of who a parent was. She talked about it, the lavender cake. "It's still on the menu," Clara said. Walter Briggs turned out to be not hard to talk to. He was 58 and retired from an engineering firm, and had strong opinions about the property tax structure in Montana that she didn't need but listened to politely. He'd had 2 serious inquiries about the Callister Street building in the past year, one from a franchise coffee chain, one from an urgent care clinic, and he'd let both of them drop because neither had felt right, which was how he explained it, and which told her something about him. "What would you do with the space?" he asked. She'd been preparing for this question for 14 months without knowing she was preparing for it. She told him. Not the practical stuff first, the equipment, the loading dock, the catering capacity, but the actual thing, what she wanted it to be. A place that was hers the way the Sycamore location was hers, but with room to grow into it. A space that could do wholesale and retail and catering without the three things fighting each other for square footage. A kitchen large enough to teach in, eventually, if that was where things went. A bakery that wasn't just a bakery, but a place. The kind of place that a town remembered it had, that became part of what a town was. Walter Briggs was quiet for a moment after she stopped. "When can you come look at it?" he said. She went the following Thursday morning, before the bakery opened, with a notepad and her measuring tape, and a flashlight for the back corners that she'd learned over the years you always needed. The building was in better shape than she'd feared and more complicated than she'd hoped, which was the honest condition of any real possibility. The loading dock worked. The front windows were exactly what she'd imagined them to be at 7 in the morning, the light coming in gold in particular. The kitchen infrastructure would need complete replacement, which was a significant cost, and the flooring in the front room had been installed badly and would need to come up, and there was a section of the back wall that had evidence of a moisture problem that would need a professional assessment before she could put a number on it. She stood in the middle of the empty main floor with her notepad and wrote things down for 45 minutes. Then she drove to the bank. Not to apply. Not yet. She had a relationship with a loan officer named Patricia Hughes, who had processed her original business loan 11 years ago and her building purchase 7 years later, and who had the quality of a person who was good at her job and did not make it into more than it was, which Clara had always found refreshing. She sat across from Patricia and said, "I want to know what I'm working with before I decide anything. Not a formal application, just a conversation." Patricia was good at conversations that were also math. They talked for an hour. Clara left with a number in her head, the realistic number, the one that was the ceiling of what she could service on current bakery revenue without eating into her reserves. And she drove to the bakery and made bread and thought about it for the rest of the day. She did not tell Silas immediately. Not because she was keeping it from him, but because she needed to think about it in her own head first, without anyone else's reaction in the room. She'd learned that about herself over the years, that she thought better about big things before she said them, and that the saying of them changed the shape of what she was thinking, and sometimes you needed the original shape for a while longer. She thought about it for 5 days. She walked past the Callister Street building twice more, once during the day and once in the early evening. She called Danny and described it and listened to his cautious, careful analysis, which was useful in the way that a good lawyer's caution is useful. It named the risks without pretending the risks were reasons not to act. On the 6th day, she called Silas. "Can I come out tonight?" she said. "I have something I want to talk through." "I'll have the porch light on," he said. She drove out in the early September evening, which was doing that thing Montana September does, where it puts the summer away with a kind of finality that feels both abrupt and correct. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and told him about Callister Street. All of it. The building, Walter Briggs and his mother and the lavender cake, Patricia Hughes and the number, the loading dock she'd been coveting quietly for 14 months. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way he got quiet when he was thinking rather than gathering himself. "What's stopping you?" he said. "Money," she said. "The kitchen infrastructure alone is going to be significant, and there's a moisture issue in the back wall I don't have a number on yet. But that's logistics. I mean," he paused. "Is there something else?" She looked at him. He had gotten very good, over the months, at asking the question under the question. She wasn't always sure she liked it. At the moment, she did. "I've been in my current space for 12 years, she said. "I know everything about it. I know where the oven runs hot and what the floor does in January and why the front door sticks when it rains. Starting over in a new space," she stopped. "Starting over is what you do," he said. "You're the best at it of anyone I've ever met. That's not necessarily a compliment." "It is," he said simply. "It means you've had to, and you've done it, and you're still here." She was quiet. "What do you need to decide?" he said. "I need to know the back wall number, and I need to run the full projections with the increased overhead." "Can I help with the projections?" I'm not offering to manage it. I just know how to read operating cost projections from running this place. And 2 sets of eyes on numbers are better than 1. She looked at him. He had said it with care, with the specific care of a man who had learned in July what the wrong framing cost and had not forgotten it. Not to manage it. He'd said that first. "Yes," she said. "You can look at the numbers." They worked on the kitchen table that night with her notepad and his calculator and the ranch's accounting ledger as a reference point for how to structure certain overhead categories, which was an imperfect analogy but useful in places. He was good at the numbers, not flashy, just steady, the way he was steady at most things. He asked questions that were the right questions. He did not suggest what she should do with the answers. They finished at 10:30. She gathered the notepad and he refilled both their coffee cups, and they sat for a few minutes in the easy quiet that had become one of the things she was most aware of when she was away from it. The specific quality of sitting with someone where the silence wasn't a vacuum to be filled. "I think you should do it," he said. "You don't know the wall number yet. I think you should do it if the wall number's survivable," he said. "Which I think it will be, because you've been watching that building for over a year and you've been thinking about a bigger space for longer than that. And you don't invest that kind of attention in things you're not going to do." She looked at him. "I'm not telling you what to decide," he said. "I'm telling you what I see when I look at you thinking about it." "That's a distinction," she said. "It's an important one," he said, and met her eyes, and she believed him. She drove home and called the contractor she used for the bakery repairs on Friday morning. He went through the Callister Street building with her on Monday. The moisture issue in the back wall turned out to be a former plumbing fixture that had been incorrectly capped when the hardware store remodeled in 2003. Not structural, not a foundation issue, and the fix was specific and bounded. The number was real but not catastrophic. She added it to the projection sheet. On Wednesday, she called Walter Briggs and made an offer. He countered. She countered back. They were on the phone for 40 minutes, and at the end of it, there was a number they had both arrived at, not the number either of them had started with, and she sat at the bakery counter after the call, looking at the notepad and thinking, this is happening. She called Danny. He congratulated her with the warmth he generally kept at a controlled temperature and said he'd look at the purchase agreement when it was ready. She called Doris, who said finally in the same tone she used for everything, which was a tone that managed to be both appropriate and excessive simultaneously, and that Clara had decided years ago was simply a feature of Doris rather than a thing to be addressed. She drove out to the ranch Thursday evening and told Silas. He smiled. Not the careful, measured version, but a real one. The kind she'd been seeing more of over the summer as the things he was careful about slowly became less necessary to be careful about. "Tell me about the wall," he said. "Old plumbing cap. Fixed, bounded cost. And the projections work?" "They work if the first winter isn't catastrophic and May is willing to come to the new location." She paused. "I haven't asked May yet." "She'll go," he said. "You don't know that. Clara, that girl would follow you to a different state." She thought about May, who had dropped a sheet pan on the floor when Clara had accepted a dinner invitation 8 months ago and then tried to pretend she hadn't. "Probably," she said. She asked May the following morning. May said yes before Clara had finished the sentence and then said, very carefully, "Can Nora come too?" And Clara said she was planning to ask her, and May said, "Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure you'd thought of it," which was the most diplomatic thing May had ever said, and suggested she'd been rehearsing it. October moved through with the purchase agreement and the inspections and the formal loan application, which Clara sat across from Patricia and completed with the same quiet paperwork is paperwork quality she'd brought to every practical step of her working life. Patricia approved it in 11 days. Clara signed the closing documents on the 14th of October, which was a Tuesday, at the same county office where she'd once stamped the LLC paperwork, different clerk, same quality of satisfaction. She owned the building on Callister Street. She stood outside it afterward for about 3 minutes, not dramatically, not performing anything, just standing there the way you stand when something has shifted and you need your body to catch up to the fact. Her phone rang. It was Thomas. She looked at the screen for a full 3 seconds. Thomas Winslow, who she had not spoken to in 4 years, whose name she had not seen on an incoming call since the last tense communication around Danny's law school graduation, where they had managed to be in the same space for 6 hours without incident, largely because Rachel had stage-managed every movement with the focused precision of an air traffic controller. She answered it. "Clara." His voice was the same. That was the thing that always caught her off guard in her imagination of this moment. She'd always assumed she'd feel more when she heard it. Mostly she just felt tired, preemptively. "Thomas, I heard you bought the Briggs building." "Small towns." She said nothing. "That's a significant expansion," he said. The tone was careful, the way his tone was always careful when he was feeling out how much room he had. "I hope you know what you're taking on." "I do," she said. "The kitchen infrastructure alone." "I know what the kitchen infrastructure costs, Thomas. I got a contractor assessment." A brief pause. "I'm just saying it's a lot for one person." One person. The phrasing was a test. She knew that, had always known how he tested. The small needles, the slight pressure on the bruise to see what response it generated. "I'm not one person," she said. "I have staff and a loan officer and a son who's a lawyer and a contractor I trust." Another pause, different in quality. She heard him recalculate. "I heard you've been seeing someone. That's not your business. I'm not making it my business. I'm just Thomas." She said his name with the specific flatness she'd learned in the first year after the divorce, when she'd needed to learn how to remove all the weight from a word without removing the word. "I know about the letter of intent. I know about Kevin Marsh. I don't know whether any of that has anything to do with you. And I've decided I don't need to know. I own 2 buildings on my own with my name on both of them and a lawyer for a son. And if anyone comes at either of those buildings, I will be ready. Are we clear?" The silence lasted about 4 seconds. "I was just calling to say congratulations," he said, in the tone of a man performing an emotion he'd decided on before the call. "Thank you," she said, in a tone that matched his for sincerity. "Goodbye, Thomas." She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk in front of her new building for another minute, the October cold starting to make itself known through her jacket. The sky was the gray-blue of mid-afternoon in fall, and the street was quiet, and the building's front windows were dark and would need cleaning before they could do what she wanted them to do with the light. She was going to need to order equipment. She needed to talk to a contractor about the kitchen build-out timeline. She needed to decide on the signage, which she'd been thinking about without admitting she was thinking about it for weeks. Peg, the retired school teacher who'd done the sycamore sign, had told her last spring that her hands weren't what they'd been, and Clara needed to find someone who could do what she wanted done. She called Silas. "I own it," she said, when he picked up. She heard him exhale, the careful, quiet satisfaction of someone who'd wanted this for her, and hadn't said so at full volume because it hadn't been his to say. "Congratulations," he said. Thomas called. A pause. "When?" "About 3 minutes ago." "What did he want?" "To congratulate me," she said, in the same dry tone she'd used with Thomas, and she heard Silas understand it completely, which was one of the specific pleasures of talking to someone who paid attention. "Are you okay?" he said. Not alarmed, just asking. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, and because she was tired of filing things away to look at later, "I'd like to come out tonight, if that's okay." "I'll make dinner," he said. "Don't make anything complicated." "Clara, everything I make isn't complicated." "That's not a compliment, and you know it." She heard him laugh, which was one of the better sounds she'd collected over the past year. She drove back to the bakery, told May, who hugged her without asking permission, which was so unlike May's usual careful respect for personal space that Clara stood there for a second genuinely surprised before she hugged back. Nora, who had been frosting a cake in the corner and pretending not to listen, said, "Well, that's wonderful," in the tone of someone who had been hoping for good news and had not admitted it even to themselves. Clara made 2 batches of bread in the afternoon with the specific purposeful calm of someone whose hands knew what to do when the rest of them needed to settle. She thought about the Callister Street building. She thought about Thomas's voice and how it had landed and how she'd hung up afterward and felt, if not entirely clean, then at least unperforated. Like the needle had met something harder than it had expected. She thought about Thomas saying a lot for one person and about the fact that she wasn't one person. She'd said it to him as defense, but it was also simply true. She had May and Nora and Danny and Rachel and Doris, who knew everything without being told, and Pete, who opened the gate, and Silas, who listened and asked what she wanted, and looked at her like she was the most interesting problem he'd ever been grateful to have. She had built that. The people. Not just the buildings, not just the business, but the specific network of trust that you couldn't buy or inherit, that only accumulated through years of showing up and being honest and not running from the hard version of things. She drove out to the ranch that evening with the windows cracked and the heater running and the particular satisfaction of someone who had spent the day doing necessary things and found them to have been sufficient. Silas had made dinner, which was better than she'd given him credit for in her warning, a soup, specifically, which was apparently the food he could reliably produce with some texture and intention behind it. They ate at the kitchen table. She told him about the Callister Street walkthrough and the contractor and the kitchen build-out timeline, which was going to require at least 4 months if they started immediately. And Pete came through once for coffee and said, "Congratulations on the building," to Clara. In the direct, unadorned way Pete said everything, and then left them to it. After dinner, in the living room, not on the porch, because the October air had made its intentions clear, Silas said, without preamble, "I've been thinking about something." She looked at him from the other end of the couch, which was exactly where she always sat, which had become her end of the couch in some quiet, unceremonious way that she found she didn't mind. I want to be careful about how I say this," he said. He was doing the thing he did when he'd been composing something in his head and was trying to deliver it in the order he'd planned, which was endearing in a way she didn't always admit to herself. "The bakery is yours. The new building is yours. Whatever that becomes, that's yours. I know that. I don't want any piece of it, and I wouldn't take it if it were offered." She waited. "But I want to help," he said. "Not with ownership, not with management. Just, if there's heavy work in the build-out, I can do that. If you need someone to move equipment, Pete and I can do that. If there's a week where things go badly and you need someone to sit at the kitchen table while you work through it, I can do that too." He met her eyes. "I'm not offering rescue. I'm offering," he seemed to look for the word, "adjacency. I want to be adjacent to the thing you're building." She looked at him for a long moment. Adjacency. It was the exact right word, which she suspected he'd found after considerable searching, and the fact that he'd searched for it rather than settling for a comfortable approximation. Said something she was going to need time to finish hearing. "Okay," she said. "Okay." "You can help with the heavy work," she said, "and the bad weeks, and the kitchen table." "That's all I wanted," he said. The fire in the wood stove made the particular sound wood stoves make in October, and the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet, and she sat at her end of the couch and thought about Thomas saying a lot for one person and about Silas saying adjacency, and she thought that between those two words was the entire distance between what she'd survived and what she was building now. She stayed until 10. He walked her to the truck, because he always did now, without either of them having decided he would. The October air was genuinely cold, the first real cold of the fall, and she could see her breath, and she hadn't brought a heavy enough jacket, and she was aware of all of it as she reached the truck door. She turned around. He was right there, closer than he usually was, and she looked at him in the particular dark of a ranch 6 miles from anywhere. No street lights, just the porch light, and the moon doing what October moons do in Montana, which was to make everything extremely clear without being warm about it. She said, "I love you." Not loudly, not with setup, just the sentence, in the cold, which she'd been not saying since July, and had apparently decided, in the space between the truck door and his face, to stop not saying. He didn't say anything for a second. She watched the second happen in his face, the thing that moved through him. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition of something he'd been careful not to want too specifically finally arriving. "I know," he said. Then, immediately, "I'm sorry, that's not, He stopped, started again. "I love you too. I said that in July. I still mean it. I'll mean it considerably past the point where it's convenient." "I know," she said, with the dry warmth she used when she was moved by something and wasn't ready to say so directly. He reached out and tucked her coat collar up, which was a small, unpracticed gesture, the kind a person makes when they can't think of what to do with their hands, and the available gesture happens to be useful. "You're going to freeze on the way home," he said. "I'm from Montana," she said. "I know how to be cold." "I know you do," he said. "Doesn't mean you should be." She got in the truck. She drove home through the October dark, heater on full, windows up this time. She thought about 4 words she'd said in a parking lot that she'd been carrying for months, like something fragile she wasn't sure she could set down without breaking. She'd set it down. It had not broken. She drove through this dark, thinking about the Callister Street building and the kitchen build-out and the sign she still needed to figure out for above the front door, and underneath all of those thoughts, running the way a river runs under ice, quiet, constant, going somewhere, was the simple fact of what she'd said and what he'd said back, and how neither of them had done anything with it except let it be exactly what it was. She got home. She went inside. She slept well, genuinely well, the kind of sleep that came from a day in which you had done real things and said true things and owned 2 buildings with your name on them. The bakery opened at 7 the next morning. The bread was good. The lavender honey cake sold out by 10:30. It was in the specific, unspectacular way of real life, a completely ordinary day. She was grateful for it in the particular way you're grateful for ordinary days when you've had enough of the other kind to know the difference. The build-out started the first week of November. Clara had hired a contractor named Roy Dillard, who came recommended by the same person who'd done her Sycamore Street repairs, and who had the particular quality she valued most in people who worked on her spaces. He told her the truth about timelines even when the truth was inconvenient, and he didn't soften the numbers to get the job and then expand them once he had it. He'd walked through the Callister Street building with her twice before giving her a quote, asked questions that were the right questions, and when she'd pushed back on one line item, he'd explained it with specifics rather than authority, which was how she'd decided he was the right person. 4 months was the timeline. 4 months if nothing went wrong, which Roy said with the tone of a man who knew things went wrong and was simply being precise about the baseline. Things went wrong in week 2, when the electrical assessment revealed that the panel was older than the initial inspection had indicated, and would need full replacement rather than partial upgrade. The number changed. Not catastrophically, but meaningfully. Clara sat across from Roy at the kitchen table of the Callister Street building. They'd set up a folding table as a makeshift site office, and looked at the revised figure and did the math in her head twice and then said, "Okay, do it right." Roy nodded. He'd expected either that or a conversation about corners she wasn't going to cut anyway. Silas found out about the electrical issue on Thursday, same as he found out about most things, she told him. She'd stopped waiting until she'd resolved something before mentioning it to him, which was a change from how she'd operated most of her adult life, where the instinct had always been to bring people solutions rather than problems, because problems felt like a request for rescue, and she didn't want to be rescued. She was still working on the distinction between asking to be rescued and telling someone something real. It wasn't always a clean line, but she was working on it. "How much of the contingency does it eat?" he said. "About 60%. "Still inside the loan?" "Yes. Uncomfortably, but yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything in the build-out timeline that can move to spring? Non-essential work that would free up some buffer?" She'd already thought about it. "The back storage room renovations. I don't need them at full capacity to open. I can phase them." "That makes sense." "I know," she said. "I'd already decided. She stopped. "Wanted to say it out loud," he said. Yes. He understood that. She'd noticed he understood a lot of things she'd spent years explaining to people and then stopped explaining because the explaining was more exhausting than the thing itself. November was cold, and the bakery on Sycamore ran as it always had, while the Callister Street building was gutted and rebuilt from the inside in the way that construction always looks. From the outside, like chaos, and from the inside, like the slow imposition of order on chaos, which Clara found oddly comforting. She went to the site every Tuesday and Thursday after close, walking through with Roy, asking questions, making decisions. Roy had stopped explaining things twice after the first 2 weeks, which meant he'd figured out she retained information and made decisions in the same meeting rather than needing to reconvene. May came once and stood in the middle of the gutted kitchen space and said, with genuine awe, "It's going to be enormous." "Compared to what we have, yes. We're going to need more bread pans. We're going to need more of everything." "Okay." May looked around again. "I'm not scared of it." Clara looked at her. May was 24 and had started as a college student who knocked things over and had turned, without announcement, into someone Clara trusted completely. "I know you're not," she said. "I just wanted to say it," May said, "in case it was useful to hear." It was. Clara didn't say so directly, but she thought about it on the drive home, the specific thing it meant to have someone tell you. They weren't afraid of what you were building, that they were coming with you into it. She'd spent so many years being careful about what she let herself need from other people, and the carefulness had served her. But it had also meant that moments like this one, a 24-year-old standing in a construction site saying, "I'm not scared," landed harder than they might have otherwise, freighted with all the years of not having that. December arrived, and with it the specific compressed pressure of the holiday bakery season, on top of a construction project, on top of a relationship. She was still figuring out how to carry alongside everything else. She was tired in November and more tired in December, and by the second week of December she was the kind of tired that stops being manageable through coffee and becomes structural, something in the body saying, "This is the load and it is not sustainable at this pace." She said so to Silas on a Thursday, just that plainly. "I'm running close to empty." He looked at her across the kitchen table. "Okay," he said. "What do you need?" "I don't know. I think I need a day that doesn't have anything in it." "Then take one." "The bakery." "May knows what she's doing. Nora knows what she's doing. Roy doesn't need you on site every week at this stage, does he?" "No," she admitted. "Then take Saturday," he said. "Come out here. Don't bring anything. Don't plan anything. Just be here." She almost argued. The arguing impulse was strong, reliable, a habit so old it felt like personality. She caught it and set it down. "Okay," she said. She came out Saturday without the notepad, and without the projections, and without anything that needed doing. She sat on the couch and read a novel she'd had on her nightstand for 4 months and eaten about 12 pages of in that time. Silas worked in the morning. The ranch didn't take Saturdays off regardless of what humans needed, and came in at noon and made soup, which was the reliable thing, and they ate it at the kitchen table without talking about anything urgent. And in the afternoon, she fell asleep on the couch for an hour and a half, which she hadn't done since Rachel's twins were born, and she'd driven 6 hours to Portland to help and come home and slept for 10 hours straight. She woke up to the sound of Pete and Silas talking in the kitchen, low voices, not trying to wake her. She lay still for a moment, not moving, just present in the moment, in the particular quality of the late afternoon light coming through the ranch house windows, and the sound of 2 men who'd worked together for 15 years talking about fence posts with the ease of people who didn't need to perform anything for each other. She thought, this is what I was tired for. Not the construction project, not the holiday rush, the having of this. The specific ordinary afternoon at the end of a hard stretch where you could lie on someone's couch and hear their life happening in the next room and feel, not just okay, but genuinely located, like you were exactly where you were supposed to be, not because fate had arranged it, but because you had made 100 small decisions that had accumulated into to this particular afternoon on this particular couch. She sat up. Pete noticed from the kitchen and said, neutrally, "Coffee's fresh," and went back to the conversation without making anything of it. And she thought, not for the first time, that Pete was one of the better people she'd encountered, mostly because he spent no energy at all trying to seem like it. Christmas came. Rachel drove up from Portland with her husband and the twins, who were 7 now, and in a phase of asking questions so specific and relentless that Rachel had started keeping a running document of the ones she couldn't answer on the spot. Danny drove up from Billings, which he did for Christmas, but not always, and which this year felt more deliberate than habitual. He arrived with a bottle of wine and spent the first hour in her kitchen eating whatever she put in front of him and telling her about a case he'd just closed. And she watched him talk and thought that he was, underneath the careful lawyer's precision, genuinely happy, and that she hadn't been certain of that for a while. She invited Silas for Christmas dinner. She'd turned it over several times. Not whether to invite him, that part she knew, but how to frame it to her children, who knew in the general sense that she was seeing someone and did not know in any specific sense what that meant. She decided the framing was less important than the fact, and told both of them simply she was seeing someone. His name was Silas. He had a ranch past the Callaway Road and a dead wife he'd loved and a good character that she'd had over a year to verify, and she'd like them to meet him. Rachel said, "Finally," in exactly the same tone as Doris, which Clara noted was perhaps something about the particular frequency of women who paid attention. Danny said, "Good," in the same quiet way he'd said it on the phone in July, like it was the answer to a question he'd been sitting with for a while. Silas came for Christmas dinner. He brought wine and a jar of the Honeycrisp apple butter that Pete's wife Rosalind made every fall from the orchard, which turned out to be the most socially successful gift of the evening, because Rachel put it on bread and then stood in the kitchen saying, "What is this?" until Danny came to investigate. He sat at Clara's table and ate her food and talked to her children and her son-in-law with the specific quality he had of being genuinely interested in people without performing it. He and Danny found, about halfway through dinner, a shared interest in water rights law that nobody else at the table could follow or particularly wanted to, and Clara watched her son and the man she loved talk about riparian easements with mutual absorption and thought, with the specific humor of a woman who'd earned the right to it, that she'd apparently chosen well on both counts. The twins, whose names were Ivy and June, determined within 45 minutes that Silas was an acceptable adult because he answered their questions directly rather than deflecting or simplifying them. June asked him if horses were smart, and he said yes, some were, and explained the difference in the way that some animals were smart about things, and some were smart about people. And June processed this carefully, and then asked a follow-up question that revealed she'd retained all of it, and Silas caught Clara's eye across the table with an expression that said, "Your granddaughter is going to be a problem for someone eventually in the best possible way." She'd agreed privately, for years. After the kids were down and Rachel's husband had fallen asleep on the couch, and Danny had driven back to the hotel he was staying at rather than sleep in Clara's guest room, which he claimed was fine, but which they both knew meant he valued his sleepover sentiment, Clara and Rachel sat in the kitchen with the wine and the comfortable debris of a family dinner, and Rachel said without setup, "I like him." "I know," Clara said. "He looks at you like he's paying attention, not like he's watching you, like he's actually attending to you." Clara looked at her wine glass. "Yes," she said, "he does." "Thomas never did that." "No," Clara said, "he didn't." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "You seem different than you did last Christmas, and different from the Christmas before that. You seem like yourself." She paused. "I know that sounds strange. You've always seemed like yourself. But there's a version of yourself that you've been not showing, I don't think, just not having access to. And you seem like you have access to it now." Clara thought about October in the parking lot. "I love you." The cold air and the porch light and not saying it for months, and then saying it because she'd stopped having a reason not to. "I'm working on something," she said. "The bakery, the new building, and yes, him." "All three at once," Rachel said. "All three at once." Rachel refilled both their glasses. "Good," she said simply. The same word Danny had used. She'd apparently raised them with a shared vocabulary for this. January arrived, and with it the opening timeline that Roy had given her in October, which he was going to meet. He told her in the second week of December, assuming the final cabinetry installation didn't take longer than quoted, which he said it shouldn't, but he wanted her to be aware. Clara appreciated the warning, which meant she was not surprised when the cabinetry installation took 4 additional days, because one of the upper cabinets had been built to SPS. But the spec had been slightly wrong, which was the contractor's fault and which Roy owned immediately and corrected at his own cost, which told her she'd been right about him. The new bakery on Collister Street opened on the 14th of January, not with fanfare. She hadn't wanted fanfare. Doris had suggested a ribbon cutting, and Clara had declined on the grounds that ribbon cuttings made her feel like she was in a commercial for something. And Doris had said she was missing an opportunity, and Clara had said she'd make the cake for the soft opening instead, and Doris had conceded this was a better allocation of talent. The soft opening was for people she knew, regulars from Sycamore Street who she'd told personally. Pete and Rosalind, who came early and stayed late, and Rosalind turned out to have opinions about commercial kitchen layout that were both specific and largely correct, which meant Clara spent 40 minutes in a genuine conversation about workflow rather than the receiving congratulations loop she'd been bracing for. Danny had driven up, which she hadn't expected. Rachel had sent flowers, which arrived at 8 in the morning before anything else, which was so perfectly Rachel in its precision of timing that Clara had stood with them for a moment before putting them in water. Silas came at 10. He'd offered to help set up the day before and she'd let him, specifically because she'd remembered what he'd said about adjacency, and had decided that the day before opening was exactly the kind of day that adjacency was for. He'd moved equipment with Pete and hadn't complained about anything that was heavy or awkward. And when she'd asked him to move a shelf twice because she'd changed her mind about the placement, he'd done it without commentary, which was the right response, and which she'd noticed and filed. But the morning of the opening, she'd asked him to come at 10, not at 7, because the first 3 hours were hers and May's and Nora's, and the particular quiet ceremony of turning on the ovens in a new space for the first time, which she'd wanted to do with just the 3 of them, the people who'd been in it from before. May had cried when they'd turned on the ovens. Not a lot. May was not a lot of crying person, but enough. She turned away and composed herself in about 4 seconds, and then said, "Okay, I'm starting the sourdough." And that was that. Nora had made the sign of something private with her hands, and then started on the pastry cream, which was correct because the pastry cream needed to be started. Clara had stood in the middle of the new kitchen for exactly 1 minute, doing nothing, just standing in it. The space was larger than she'd imagined, even when she'd been imagining it. The light through the front windows did exactly what she'd hoped it would do at that hour. The ovens were the good ones, the ones she'd specified, and the sound they made warming up was different from the sycamore ovens, and she was going to need to learn the new rhythms the way she'd learned every space she'd ever worked in, by listening to it, by paying attention to how it ran hot and where it ran cool and what it needed from her specifically. She was going to enjoy that. The learning of a new space. She hadn't expected to look forward to that part, but she did. Silas arrived at 10 with Doris, who had apparently called him and arranged to share a ride on the grounds that she didn't want to drive in January, and he was going past her house anyway, which was efficient if slightly conspiratorial. They came in together, Doris in her good coat, Silas in his usual jacket, and he looked at the space, the full space, lit and open, with the display case stocked and the smell of the morning's bread already in the room, and she watched his face do something uncomplicated and true. "Well," he said. "Don't make it a big speech," she said. "I wasn't going to make a speech." "Good. I was going to say it looks like you," he said. "The space. It looks like what you would have built if you'd built it from scratch on day one." She looked around at it. The clean lines, the practical layout, the front windows she'd refused to put anything in front of because she wanted the light. The sign above the door, which Peg hadn't been able to do this time, her hands truly had gotten worse, but which had been done by a young sign painter from 2 towns over whom Peg had personally recommended and supervised, standing over him with the specific authority of a woman who'd taught school for 32 years and wasn't going to stop telling people how to do things correctly simply because she was retired. Clara's. Same as always. "I know," she said. "The soft opening went well, which is to say it went imperfectly in the specific ways that openings go imperfectly. The espresso machine took 40 minutes to calibrate correctly. One of the display case lights flickered until May found the loose connection and fixed it with a persistence that suggested she'd done this before, and a shelf of small jars of the Honeycrisp apple butter that Clara had stocked as a retail item sold out entirely by 11:30, which was gratifying and meant she needed to call Rosalind about expanding the arrangement, which was a good problem to have. By noon, the soft opening had blurred into something that looked just like a regular busy morning, which was the best possible thing it could have become. Doris ate 2 pieces of the lavender honey cake and told 3 separate people about it while they were standing right next to the display case that clearly contained it, which was either the most effective or most redundant marketing strategy Clara had ever witnessed. Pete found his way to the kitchen at some point and stood in the doorway with his coffee looking at the equipment with the expression of a man who genuinely respected good workmanship regardless of context, and said to Clara simply, "Nice setup," which from Pete she understood to be the equivalent of a standing ovation. By 2 o'clock, the soft opening crowd had thinned, and the people who remained were the ones who had settled in with the intent to stay, which was also exactly right. Clara sat down for the first time at 11. She'd been on her feet since 4:30, and sat at one of the tables near the front windows and looked at the room and let herself have the feeling she'd been keeping at arm's length all morning because she'd needed to stay functional. She'd built this with her own money and her own hands and her own judgment, and a son who was a lawyer and a contractor who told the truth about timelines, and a loan officer who'd trusted her numbers, and a 24-year-old who'd said, "I'm not scared" in an empty construction site in November, and meant it. She'd built this, and nobody had rescued her, and nobody had funded it, and nobody's name was on it except hers. She sat with that for approximately 3 minutes. Then May appeared and asked whether she wanted to start the tomorrow prep now, or come in early, and Clara said come in early. And the moment passed into the practical, which was where it belonged. Silas found her at the window table. He sat down across from her without asking, which was something he'd been doing for months now. The not asking. The easy familiarity of someone who had learned the geography of another person and moved through it without constant calibration. She'd decided months ago that she didn't mind it. She minded it less every week. "You should eat something," he said. "I've been eating things all morning." "You've been tasting things. That's not eating." She looked at him. "When did you become an expert on the difference?" "I've watched you for over a year," he said. "You taste compulsively when you're in a kitchen. You forget to eat when you're busy. Those are different activities." She wanted to argue with the accuracy of this. She couldn't. "May made a sandwich," she said. "I'll eat it later." "May made it 4 hours ago." "I know when May made it." "Clara." "I will eat the sandwich," she said, "after the last person leaves." He looked at her with the patient expression he'd gotten very good at. Not the performance of patience, which was its own kind of pressure, but actual patience, The kind that came from genuinely not needing her to do anything differently than she was doing it. The kind that waited because it could wait, and not because it was bracing. "Okay," he said. They sat at the window table while the afternoon light did what January afternoon light in Montana does, which was to go golden and then go quickly, the days still short, the cold outside making the warmth inside feel more deliberate. The room was mostly quiet now. Nora was cleaning the display case. May was somewhere in the back doing the same. Doris had left an hour ago with a full bag and the expression of a woman who was going to have strong opinions about the new location for the foreseeable future, which Clara was entirely prepared for. "I want to ask you something," Silas said. She looked at him. His tone had shifted, not dramatically, but the way the air in a room shifts when someone has been holding something and decides to put it on the table. "Okay," she said. He reached into his jacket pocket and put something on the table between them. A ring. Not a large ring, not the kind that was a statement about wealth or theater. A plain gold band with a small stone, oval, a warm color she'd need better light to name. It looked old, the way things looked old when they'd been worn and handled rather than aged artificially. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "Not Ellen's, my grandmother's. I want to be clear about that. Ellen's ring is in a box in my dresser, and it's going to Marcus eventually, because Ellen would have wanted that, and this has nothing to do with that." He looked at the ring and then at her. "I found it in the back of a drawer 2 months ago, and I had it cleaned, and I've been carrying it since October because I kept waiting for the right moment, and then deciding the moment wasn't right. And I think if I wait for the right moment, I'll carry it until spring, and that seems—" He stopped. "I love you. You know that. You've known it since July. I'd like to marry you, not because either of us needs rescuing, not because the ranch needs managing, not because anything practical needs solving." He paused. "Because it's been over a year, and every Thursday I want it to be Thursday, and every Saturday I want it to be Saturday, and the days that don't have you in them are the ones I notice for the wrong reason. That's the whole argument. That's all I've got." Clara looked at the ring on the table, then at him. She thought about the courthouse at 44, sitting in the parking lot with the divorce papers and thinking, now what? She thought about the first loan, the unsigned lease, the moment she'd stood outside this building, the Callister Street building, years before she'd ever thought of buying it, and seen the light through the windows at 7 in the morning and thought, someday. She thought about everything she'd built and kept and refused to hand over or diminish or walk away from. She thought about how not one single piece of it required her to say no to this. That was the thing she hadn't understood when she was younger. That love and freedom were not a zero-sum arrangement. That the right person didn't want the part of you that you'd fought hardest to protect. That choosing someone didn't mean you were trading something. It meant you'd found someone to be accountable to without shrinking. She'd thought those were incompatible things for so long that finding out they weren't had taken the full year to absorb. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again. That was always going to be yes. I just needed to build the bakery first. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile and was more than one. The specific expression of a man who understood what she'd just said and why the order mattered and didn't need her to explain it. "I know," he said. He picked up the ring and put it on the table closer to her, and she picked it up and looked at it in the afternoon light. The stone was amber, almost a warm brown gold that she couldn't name precisely. She put it on her right hand because her left hand was the working hand, and she was going to need to think about that practically, and he watched her do it without correcting anything. "Right hand," he said. "I'm in a kitchen 6 hours a day." "Right hand is fine," he said. May appeared in the doorway to the back and then immediately disappeared, which meant she'd seen, and which meant that by tomorrow morning Nora would know, and by tomorrow afternoon Doris would know, and by the end of the week the entire customer base of both bakery locations would know. Because that was the nature of small towns, and also the nature of Mai, who was incapable of holding good news for longer than 12 hours. Clara looked at the ring on her hand. Right hand, working hand, flour-dusted and practical, and hers. "I want a small wedding," she said. "Whatever you want. I mean genuinely small. Not small as a polite word for medium. Small. Clara, I have 2 sons I'd like to invite, and Pete and Rosalind. That's already small." "Good," she said. "Then we agree." They got married in April, on the kind of April day Montana occasionally produced as if apologizing for the winter. Clear and warm, the light that particular soft gold of early spring before things got complicated. The ceremony was in the backyard of a friend's property outside of town, which Doris had organized because Doris organized things, not obtrusively, but in the way water organizes itself around what's in front of it, eventually getting everywhere it needed to go. There were 42 people. Clara had counted the invitations. 42 was the number that turned out to include everyone who mattered, without including anyone who was there as an obligation or an appearance, and she was satisfied with it in the specific way she was satisfied when a recipe produced what she intended it to produce. Danny walked her in because she'd asked him to, and because the expression on his face when she'd asked was the kind of expression she wanted to remember. Rachel was there with her husband and Ivy and June, who had been briefed on appropriate wedding behavior and had maintained it for approximately 20 minutes before June found Silas's younger son, Garrett, interesting and started asking him questions about salmon with an intensity that suggested she'd been waiting for an opportunity to discuss salmon for some time. Garrett, who worked in environmental conservation and spent a meaningful portion of his working life thinking about salmon, appeared genuinely delighted to have been found by her. Marcus had flown in from Denver. He was quieter than she'd expected, more like Silas in the way he moved and less like him in the way he talked. Faster, more guarded, the specific guardedness of someone who'd spent years managing a distance from his father that he'd only recently started to close. He'd shaken her hand when they met, properly, and then said, "He's better this past year. I want you to know I've noticed that." She'd said, "So have I." And he'd nodded, and that was the whole of it, but it was enough. Pete stood in the back with his wife, and when Clara caught his eye during the ceremony, he nodded once, the small, conclusive nod of a man confirming that what was happening was correct. And she thought that the nod meant more to her than she would have predicted. The ceremony was short. Both of them had wanted short. Not because the thing wasn't serious, but because the thing didn't need to be long to be serious, and they'd both been at this long enough to know the difference between meaning and performance. The person officiating was a county judge named Harriet Bloom, who had been friends with Clara for 12 years and who kept the language plain and true. Silas said his vows looking at her the way he looked at her when he was paying attention, which was the way he always looked at her. Not watching, not performing awareness, but genuinely present. The specific, full attention of someone who had decided that the person in front of them was worth the full weight of what he had. She said hers back looking at him the same way. They were not perfect vows. She stumbled on one word and he paused too long before starting his, and Ivy whispered something to June that made June cover her mouth. And it was all imperfect in the specific way that real things are imperfect and perfect things are not real. Doris cried. She would later tell people she hadn't, but she did, and everyone saw, and nobody said anything because Doris had earned it. The bakery's first full winter had been, as Clara had told Patricia Hughes it would be if the numbers held, manageable. Not easy. The month of February had been the tightest, the way first Februaries always were, the new space finding its rhythms, the regulars who'd followed from Sycamore starting to bring new people with them in the hesitant way customers recommended things they weren't yet sure would stay. But the lavender honey cake had made it through February the same way it made it through every other month, by selling out before 11 and making people plan around it. And by March, the Callister Street location had begun to feel like itself, rather than like a space trying to become itself. May had hired a weekend morning person, a quiet young man named Theo, who had no baking experience but excellent instincts, and the specific quality of someone who paid attention to what was actually happening rather than what they expected to happen, which Clara considered the most important trait after reliable hands. She'd told him that in his second week and he'd written it down, which she'd found both endearing and promising. Nora had, without announcement, become the person who trained new staff, which was not a title anyone had given her, in which she performed with the authority of someone who knew exactly what they knew and had no interest in territory beyond that. Clara had decided to formalize it, a small raise, an official title, and Nora had received this information with the equanimity of someone who'd known it was coming and had simply been waiting for the institution to catch up. The Sycamore location stayed open. Clara had gone back and forth about it, whether to consolidate, whether to close the original space once the new one was established. And she'd eventually decided to keep it, not purely for sentimental reasons, though those were present, but because the two locations served different functions in the town's geography, and because the Sycamore space had good bones and a reliable customer base, and she'd built it, and she wasn't going to close something that was working simply because she'd built something better. She ran both, and it was harder than one, and it was worth it. On a Saturday in late May, almost exactly a year after Silas had walked back into the Sycamore Bakery after his recovery. Moving carefully with the weight of 3 weeks in a back room still on him, Clara stood at the counter of the Callister Street location in the morning rush and watched him come through the door. He came on Saturdays still, the same as always. The first Saturday after the wedding, he'd come in and ordered apple pie and black coffee and sat at one of the tables near the front windows. And May had brought it to him, and Clara had noticed from the kitchen that May was smiling in a way she was trying to make neutral, and that Silas had tipped his coffee cup slightly in Clara's direction when she appeared in the kitchen doorway, a gesture so small and habitual and his that she'd had to look away before she embarrassed herself. I was at the counter table now, the one near the window, same pie, same coffee. The morning had been busy and was settling. May was in the back. Nora was showing Theo something about the pastry cream with the focused authority she brought to everything. Clara wiped down the counter. She walked over and sat down across from him, which she could do now in the new space in a way she'd never quite done at Sycamore. The tables were positioned differently. The layout gave her more room to move between customer and staff without it being a production. He looked at her across the table. The May light was coming through the front windows exactly the way she'd hoped it would, when she'd stood in an empty building 14 months ago and looked at the angle of the morning sun. "Good pie," he said. "It's always good pie," she said. "This batch is better." She looked at him. "There's a note in it," he said. "Different, something you're not usually putting in." She considered. "I added a little cardamom, quarter teaspoon. I've been thinking about it for a month." "It works," he said. "I know," she said. "I knew before I put it in. I just needed to decide to do it." Understood. She could see it. That she wasn't only talking about the pie. He picked up his fork, and she sat across from him in the morning light of the thing she'd built with her own hands, wearing a ring on her right hand, wearing flour on her left, married to a man who had walked into a bakery on a Saturday because he was looking for something that tasted like it mattered, and had found, after all the careful months of apple pie and Saturdays, and not crowding each other and learning the difference between need and love, something that did. That was all it had ever been, that simple and that hard. Two people who had been through enough to know better, deciding to go through something good together. On a Saturday morning in Montana, with the light coming in the way it did, and the bread in the oven, and May laughing at something in the back kitchen, and the town moving past the windows without knowing or caring that anything significant was happening inside. Clara Winslow sat across from her husband and let the ordinary morning be exactly what it was. Which was, it turned out, enough. More than enough. The kind of enough that you spent years not believing in and then found, in the most undramatic possible way, to have been available the whole time, waiting for you to stop running from it long enough to sit down and let it land. She sat. She let it land. The bread smelled right. The light was good. Silas finished his coffee and looked at her with that attending look, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said or done or built. And that, finally, was everything.